There's a lamp burning in a study somewhere in Vienna, 1873. The cartographer hasn't moved in hours. His hands rest on the edges of a map, spread across mahogany, fingers trembling slightly, not from age, but from something else. Something closer to recognition. The map before him shows the world as it was understood then. Every territory labelled, every border drawn with the confidence of men who believe they've charted everything worth knowing. But there, sprawling across the northern regions of Asia like a sleeping giant, is a name that will soon begin vanishing from such maps. Tartary, Grand Tartary. The ink, spelling it out, is precise, ornate, the kind of lettering reserved for empires and kingdoms, not empty steppes or forgotten badlands. He's seen this name his entire career, on maps from France, from England, from Dutch cartographers and German scholars. Always the same massive territory, always labelled with the certainty that something significant occupied that space. But lately, the new maps crossing his desk tell a different story. The name is fragmenting, breaking apart into smaller pieces, or disappearing entirely, replaced by provincial designations and colonial boundaries. He wonders, in the quiet of that lamp-lit room, what it means when a place that size simply stops existing on paper. Now move forward. Different room, different century. It's late, past midnight, and someone sits in front of a glowing screen, scrolling through a digital archive of historical maps. They're not looking for anything in particular, just falling down one of those internet rabbit holes that happen when sleep feels distant and curiosity feels urgent. A map from 1716 appears, then one from 1754, another from 1876. And there it is, again and again. Tartary, Tartaria, Great Tartary, Independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary. Each map shows it covering territory larger than Europe, spanning what we now call Siberia, stretching down into Central Asia, reaching toward Mongolia and Tibet, and the edges of China and Persia. The person stops scrolling. Their screen shows multiple maps now, laid out in browser tabs, all from different decades, different cartographers, different countries, all showing the same thing. An empire, or territory, or civilization that covered more land than almost anything else labelled on those maps. More land than the Ottoman Empire, more land than the lands claimed by Spain or France or Britain at their heights. And yet, sitting there in the blue light of a modern screen, this person realizes something strange. They've never heard of it, not in school, not in documentaries, not in any history book they can remember. They search for Tartaria in a modern atlas. Nothing. They search in their memory of history classes, trying to recall any mention. Nothing surfaces. It's as if millions of square miles of territory, labelled consistently across centuries of mapmaking, simply ceased to exist, not as a place, but as a concept, as a name, as something worth remembering or teaching. The maps don't look like mistakes. They're detailed, showing cities within Tartaria, rivers cutting through its territories, mountain ranges marking its borders. These weren't sketches of blank, unknown lands labelled with guesses. These were maps produced by the best cartographers of their time. Maps that appeared in official atlases used by governments and merchants and scholars. Maps that treated Tartaria as real, as known, as significant. Where did it go? Not the land itself, which obviously still exists as Russia and Kazakhstan and Mongolia and a dozen other modern nations. But the name, the concept, the unified identity that once seemed so certain that cartographers across Europe agreed to put it on their maps for over 2 centuries. Where did that go? And more pressing, stranger, more unsettling in the deep hours of night. Why don't we know about it? Let's look closer at what these maps actually show, because the details matter here. In 1716, a respected British cartographer named Herman Moll published a world atlas that included a detailed map of Asia. Across the northern regions, he labelled a vast territory as Tartary, subdividing it into sections: Great Tartary, Little Tartary, Muscovite Tartary. The map shows cities within these regions, caravan routes crossing the territory, geographical features like lakes and mountain ranges. This wasn't a map of terra incognita, of unknown lands marked with vague labels. Moll was depicting a place with internal structure, with human settlement, with geographical knowledge. Move forward to 1754. French cartographer Jean-Baptiste Bourguignon d'Anville considered one of the most accurate and scholarly mapmakers of his era, produced a map specifically of Tartary. It's remarkably detailed. Cities are marked throughout the territory. The map distinguishes between different regions within Tartary, showing political and geographical divisions. D'Anville wasn't some fringe figure making speculative maps. He worked for the French king, corresponded with Jesuit missionaries who traveled through Asia, consulted Chinese geographical sources. His maps were taken seriously by European governments and scholars. By 1876, something starts changing. Stanford's map from that year still shows Tartary, but now it's fragmented into more specific designations: Chinese Tartary, independent Tartary, Russian Tartary. The unified concept is breaking apart, being absorbed into the expanding boundaries of surrounding empires. Russia is pushing eastward across Siberia. China is consolidating control over Western territories. The British Empire is eyeing Central Asia from the south. And with these political changes, the cartographic labels change too. Tartary becomes subdivisions, becomes provinces, becomes colonial designations. By the early 20th century, the name largely disappears from maps altogether. The land is still there, obviously, but it's now labeled as parts of the Russian Empire, then the Soviet Union, as Chinese territories, as newly defined regions like Turkestan, or Siberia, or Mongolia. The word Tartary, which had appeared on European maps for over 200 years, simply stops being used. It's not that cartographers discovered they'd been wrong. The physical geography hadn't changed. The cities marked on earlier maps were real cities that still existed. The rivers and mountains were accurately placed. But the name itself, the concept of Tartary as a unified territory or civilization, just vanishes from the cartographic record. What's strange is how thorough this disappearance was. If you look at a modern atlas, you won't find Tartary anywhere. If you search modern encyclopedias, you'll find brief mentions explaining it as an archaic European term for the vaguely known regions of Central and North Asia, nothing more. Modern history textbooks, when they discuss this region during the period when maps labeled it Tartary, typically describe it as home to various nomadic tribes, scattered khanates, and underdeveloped territories that were eventually civilized and modernized by Russian and Chinese expansion. The historical narrative suggests emptiness, primitiveness, lack of unified civilization, but that's not what the old maps suggest. They suggest cartographers from multiple countries over multiple centuries believed something significant enough existed there to label it, to name it, to map its internal features. These weren't maps marking unknown territories with speculative names. They were maps showing known places. The cities marked within Tartary weren't imaginary. Many of them are cities that exist today under different names, or as archaeological sites, or as documented historical settlements. The trade routes shown crossing Tartary were real routes used for centuries. The geographical features were accurately depicted, so we're left with a tension between two different kinds of evidence. The cartographic record says something called Tartary existed here, significant enough to map, to name, to treat as a major feature of Asian geography. The modern historical narrative says nothing unified existed there, just scattered peoples and minor kingdoms that don't merit attention or a collective name. The maps say empire, or at least vast organized territory. The textbooks say empty land. Somebody's story doesn't add up. Either the maps were fundamentally mistaken for 2 centuries, labeling something that wasn't really there, or the modern historical narrative has somehow minimized or forgotten something that once seemed too significant to ignore. Maps can be wrong, of course. Cartographers can label things incorrectly, can repeat errors, can map places based on travelers' tales rather than direct knowledge. So maybe the maps don't prove anything definitive about what Tartary actually was. But maps aren't the only evidence that something strange happened in this part of the world. There's something else, something harder to dismiss. The buildings. Travel through Russia, through parts of Central Asia, even through certain cities in North America, and you'll notice something peculiar about the architecture from the 1800s. There's a consistency to it, a shared aesthetic that appears across thousands of miles. Ornate neoclassical buildings with perfect symmetry, massive structures with engineering that seems almost too advanced for their supposed construction dates, decorative elements of extraordinary intricacy. These buildings don't look like they were thrown together quickly by frontier societies. They look like the work of an established civilization with accumulated knowledge, wealth, and architectural tradition. Take one example: the Kazan Cathedral in St. Petersburg. Official history says it was built between 1801 and 1811, using the construction techniques available at that time. Hand-cut stone, manual labor, basic tools and equipment. And yet the cathedral displays engineering precision that modern architects study and struggle to fully explain. The symmetry is perfect, down to tiny measurements. The structural load distribution shows sophisticated understanding of physics. The decorative elements are carved with a consistency that would require either massive, coordinated workforces of master craftsmen or techniques that shouldn't have existed yet. And it's not just the Kazan Cathedral. Across the territories once labelled as Tartaria on those old maps, you find similar buildings. Government structures, cathedrals, railway stations, municipal buildings, all displaying the same level of sophistication, the same architectural language, the same puzzling precision. Official histories attribute these buildings to Russian imperial expansion in the 1800s, to the civilizing influence of European architecture spreading eastward. But that explanation creates its own questions. How did recently settled frontier regions suddenly produce architecture rivaling anything in Paris or Vienna? Where did the craftsmen come from? How were such massive projects funded and coordinated across such vast distances? Some people look at these buildings and see something else. Not new construction representing Russian achievement, but inherited structures from something older. Buildings that were already there when Russian expansion reached those territories. Buildings that were simply claimed, renovated, repurposed, and credited to the new authorities. It's a theory, unproven, speculative, but it's a theory that emerges from looking at the buildings themselves and asking, does the official timeline really make sense? These buildings exist. They're not myths or legends or conspiracy theories. They're physical structures you can visit, touch, measure, photograph. They're real. But the story of who built them and when, the narrative of how such architectural sophistication appeared so suddenly across such enormous territories, that's where things get complicated. That's where the certainty of official history starts feeling less certain, where the questions multiply faster than the answers. Before we go deeper into mysteries and anomalies, it's worth understanding what mainstream history actually says about this region. Not to dismiss it or mock it, but to know what the accepted narrative is, because you can't recognize gaps in a story until you know what the story claims to be. According to standard historiography, the territory labelled Tartaria on old maps was never a unified empire or civilization. It was a European catch-all term, a vague geographical designation for the largely unmapped interior of Asia. Historians explain it the same way they explain terms like the Orient or the Indies, words Europeans used to gesture toward vast regions they didn't fully understand. These weren't names that the people living there called themselves. They were external labels, imposed from a distance by cartographers working in London or Paris or Amsterdam, who needed something to write on empty spaces on their maps. The mainstream historical timeline goes like this. After the Mongol Empire fragmented in the 13 and 1400s, the vast territories of Central and North Asia broke into smaller political entities. Various khanates emerged, the remnants of Mongol power. The Kazakh Khanate controlled parts of Central Asia. The Siberian Khanate held territories in western Siberia. Other regions were dominated by different Turkic and Mongolic tribal confederations, semi-nomadic peoples who moved seasonally, who built some permanent settlements, but maintained mobile lifestyles suited to the harsh steppes and forests and deserts they inhabited. Meanwhile, from the west, the Russian Empire began its long expansion eastward. Throughout the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s, Russian explorers, traders, soldiers, and settlers pushed across the Ural Mountains into Siberia, establishing outposts, claiming territories, subjugating local populations. By the late 1800s, most of what had been labelled Tartary on earlier maps had become part of the Russian Empire. From the south and east, China expanded its control over western territories, absorbing regions into what would become Xinjiang and other provinces. By the early 20th century, the entire region was divided between Russian control in the north and Chinese control in the south, with some areas like Mongolia achieving various degrees of independence or autonomy. The peoples who lived in these regions during this period, mainstream history tells us, were various Turkic tribes, Mongolic peoples, the remnants of the Golden Horde, and other groups whose names fill ethnographic catalogues but rarely appear in general history textbooks. These were, according to the standard narrative, relatively small-scale societies, nomadic or semi-nomadic cultures, tribal rather than imperial, decentralized rather than unified. They had rich cultural traditions, sophisticated survival strategies for harsh environments, impressive horsemanship and military tactics, extensive trade networks connecting them to the Silk Road and to neighboring civilizations. But they weren't, in this telling, a unified, advanced civilization. They weren't building the kinds of state structures or architectural monuments that would cause historians to treat them as a major empire worth extended study. That's the official story. And it's important to note that it's not a story invented from nothing. There's archaeological evidence for these various khanates and tribal groups. There are historical documents describing Russian expansion. There are records of treaties, conflicts, trade relations, all the ordinary documentation of historical events. This isn't a narrative built on lies or fabrications. It's a narrative built on selecting certain pieces of evidence, emphasizing certain patterns, and organizing them into a coherent timeline that makes sense within the framework of how Western historians understand and categorize civilizations. The mainstream explanation for why Tartary disappeared from maps is straightforward. As European geographical knowledge improved, vague catch-all terms were replaced with more accurate, specific designations. Tartary stopped appearing on maps not because something was being hidden, but because cartographers learned the actual names of regions and peoples and began using those instead. Siberia, Mongolia, Turkestan, Kazakhstan. These more precise terms replaced the imprecise Tartary. That's how knowledge progresses, how understanding improves. The mysterious becomes known, the general becomes specific. This explanation answers many questions. It explains why different maps showed Tartary in slightly different ways, why the borders were vague, why the name eventually disappeared. It fits within a larger pattern of how European knowledge of the world expanded and became more accurate over time. It doesn't require assuming any conspiracies or hidden histories. It's logical, comprehensive, supported by conventional historical methodology. But there's something this explanation struggles with. If Tartary was just a vague term for unmapped territories inhabited by scattered nomadic tribes, then who built the cities that appear on those Tartary maps? Who created the architectural consistency that appears across 4,000 miles of territory? Why did travelers' accounts describe organized urban centers and sophisticated infrastructure in regions that mainstream history portrays as undeveloped frontiers? The official story answers the question of what Europeans called this region, but it doesn't fully answer what actually existed there. And that's where things get interesting. History books give us one version of what existed in the territories labeled Tartary. But there's another version, older, written by people who actually traveled through those lands before they were absorbed into Russia and China. And those accounts describe something different from the scattered nomadic tribes of modern textbooks. In the 1270s, Marco Polo traveled extensively through what Europeans would later map as Tartary. His accounts describe not empty steppes but cities, courts, administrative systems. He writes about meeting officials who governed territories, about urban centers with markets and craftsmen, about regions with organized political structures. Now, Marco Polo's reliability as a source has been debated for centuries. Some historians question whether he actually went everywhere he claimed. But even skeptical historians acknowledge that his accounts contain accurate details about Central Asian geography and cultures that suggest he at least had access to reliable information about these regions. And what that information describes is substantially more developed than the primitive frontier of popular imagination. William of Rubruck, a Franciscan friar, travelled through Tartary in the 1250s as an emissary to the Mongol court. His account is more sober than Polo's, less prone to exaggeration, and generally considered reliable by historians. He describes encountering substantial settlements, organized governance, established trade networks, and sophisticated material culture. He writes about cities with permanent buildings, about administrators collecting taxes and maintaining roads, about craftsmen producing textiles and metalwork of impressive quality. These aren't descriptions of scattered nomads barely surviving in harsh conditions. These are descriptions of functioning civilizations with infrastructure and economic complexity. Moving forward in time, European travelers in the 1600s and 1700s continued describing more than what modern history books suggest should have been there. Various ambassadors, merchants, and explorers wrote accounts of their journeys through Central Asian territories. They described cities they visited, governments they negotiated with, architectural structures that impressed them. These weren't fringe writings by unreliable sources. Many were official reports sent back to European governments, intended as accurate intelligence about regions that European powers were beginning to take interest in. The tension here is subtle but significant. These historical accounts aren't necessarily describing one unified Tartarian empire. They're describing diverse cities and regions, different ethnic groups, various political entities. But what they consistently describe is more organization, more urban development, more architectural and economic sophistication than the standard narrative of nomadic tribes suggests should have existed. The accounts describe permanent settlements, where the textbooks emphasize mobility. They describe administrative systems, where the textbooks emphasize tribal autonomy. They describe architectural achievement, where the textbooks describe primitive conditions. So what happened? Why do these older primary sources describe something more substantial than modern secondary sources acknowledge? One possibility is that the travelers exaggerated or misunderstood what they saw. Europeans encountering Central Asian cultures might have been impressed by things that weren't actually that impressive, might have described as cities what were really just large seasonal encampments, might have mistaken temporary structures for permanent architecture. That's possible. Travelers' accounts are notoriously unreliable, prone to embellishment and cultural misinterpretation. But there's another possibility. Perhaps it's not that the travelers were wrong, but that modern historical narratives have simplified and minimized what actually existed. Perhaps in the process of organizing Central Asian history into neat categories and focusing on the stories that Western historians found most interesting, particularly the story of Russian expansion and modernization, what came before was downplayed or dismissed. History isn't just what happened. History is what we choose to remember, what we choose to emphasize, what fits into the narratives we're trying to tell. 19th and 20th century Western historians were primarily interested in Western expansion, in European-style state structures, in civilizations that looked familiar to European models of development, Central Asian societies that didn't fit those models, that organized themselves differently, that built different kinds of structures and maintained different kinds of political systems, might have been seen as less important, less worth studying in detail, less relevant to the grand narrative of world history that was being constructed, not deliberately hidden necessarily, but allowed to fade into the background, simplified into brief mentions of nomadic tribes and tribal conflicts. If these travelers' accounts describe real places and real achievements, some evidence should remain. Buildings don't disappear just because historians decide they're not important. Cities leave traces, even after they're abandoned or absorbed into new political entities. Infrastructure endures. So, if there was more there than modern histories acknowledge, the physical evidence should still exist. And that's exactly what some people claim to have found. Not just in Central Asia, but in places much closer, in buildings and structures that exist right now, that anyone can visit and examine and wonder about. The question is whether those structures tell the story we've been told, or whether they suggest something different. Let's return to the maps themselves and look more carefully at what they actually show, because maps are strange documents. They're supposed to represent objective reality, geographical facts that exist regardless of who's drawing them. But maps are also created by people with specific perspectives, serving specific purposes, funded by governments with specific interests. Maps don't just show the world, they show how the mapmaker understands the world, or wants others to understand it. Watch how Tartary appears and evolves across different centuries of mapmaking. In the 1600s, European maps show Tartary as a massive region, with vague boundaries and minimal internal detail. The label is there, covering enormous territory, but the specifics are fuzzy. This makes sense if European cartographers knew something significant existed in those regions, but didn't have detailed information about it. They knew the name, knew roughly where it was, knew it was big enough to matter, but lacked the kind of first-hand exploration data that would let them map it precisely. By the 1700s, something changes. Maps become more detailed. Tartary starts appearing with internal subdivisions: Great Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Russian Tartary, Independent Tartary, Tibetan Tartary. This suggests growing European knowledge. Cartographers were learning that what they'd been labeling as one vague region was actually multiple distinct areas. They were gathering more specific geographical information, identifying cities within these territories, marking mountain ranges and rivers with increasing accuracy. The 1754 Danville map, for instance, shows numerous cities within Tartary, shows trade routes crossing through it, shows it as a populated, organized space, rather than unknown wilderness. Then, as the 1800s progress, fragmentation accelerates. The subdivisions become more specific. Russian Tartary expands as Russian control extends eastward. Chinese Tartary appears as China consolidates its western territories. Independent Tartary shrinks, squeezed between expanding empires. By the late 1800s, the name Tartary is mostly gone, replaced by designations like Siberia, Turkestan, Mongolia, various Russian provinces, and Chinese territories. By the early 1900s, standard atlases no longer show Tartary at all. The name has been completely replaced by the political and geographical terms we still use today. This evolution can be interpreted two ways. The mainstream interpretation: this represents improving European knowledge, replacing vague terms with accurate ones. As exploration increased, as Russian and Chinese control provided more information, cartographers naturally updated their maps to reflect better understanding. The alternative interpretation: this represents political consolidation, erasing a previous identity. As empires absorbed territories, they renamed them, relabeled them, overwrote previous designations with their own. Both interpretations might be partially true. The name itself is interesting. Tartary derives from Tatar, referring to various Turkic and Mongolic peoples, but Europeans conflated it with Tartarus, the Greek underworld, reflecting their perception of these regions as dark, mysterious, threatening, inhabited by fearsome peoples who'd once invaded Europe under Mongol leadership. The name carried connotations of danger and otherness. It was never a self-designation. The peoples living in these regions called themselves by their specific tribal or ethnic names: Mongols, Kazakhs, Uyghurs, numerous Turkic peoples, each with their own identity. Tartary was what Europeans called them collectively, lumping diverse peoples into one category, the same way Europeans used Indies to describe everything from India to Indonesia to the Americas. But here's the tension. If Tartary was just European ignorance, just a vague term for regions Europeans didn't understand, why does it appear so consistently on maps from different countries over 2 centuries? Why do maps from England and France and Germany and the Netherlands all show Tartary in roughly the same place? Why do some maps include significant internal details about Tartary if it was purely a placeholder for unknown territory? The 1700s maps don't show Tartary as blank space. They show it as a territory with cities, with geographical features, with structure. Something was there that multiple independent cartographers recognized as significant enough to map and label consistently. What did non-European sources call this region? Chinese sources used various terms for different peoples and territories in their western regions. Persian and Arabic sources had their own complex geographical nomenclature. Russian sources evolved their terminology as Russian presence in the region increased. There wasn't one unified indigenous name for the entire territory that Europeans labeled Tartary, which could mean either that no unified civilization existed to name itself, or that a diverse multi-ethnic region existed that Europeans simplified under one catch-all label. Both are possible. Maps are political documents. They reflect power as much as geography. Names appear on maps, persist for centuries, then vanish, not always because knowledge improves, but sometimes because power shifts. The disappearance of Tartary from maps happens precisely when Russian and Chinese empires consolidate control over those territories. Is that timing just coincidence? Or does conquest always involve renaming, relabeling, making the conquered territory seem like it was always part of the conqueror's natural domain? There's a way of looking at old buildings that most people don't practice. Not looking at them as tourists admiring beauty, but as detectives examining evidence. Looking at the technical details, the engineering choices, the implications of what it would actually take to create what you're seeing. When you look at buildings across Russia, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, even parts of North America built supposedly in the 1800s, something emerges, a pattern, an architectural signature that appears again and again across thousands of miles. Start with the symmetry. Perfect, mathematical symmetry. Buildings where the left side mirrors the right side down to centimeters of precision. Facades where every window aligns perfectly with the ones above and below it, where decorative elements repeat with machine-like consistency. This level of symmetry requires either incredibly precise planning and measurement or standardized prefabricated components. Both are achievable, but both require sophisticated organization, resources, and technical capability. Yet we're told many of these buildings appeared in frontier regions, in cities that were supposedly recently established outposts on the edges of expanding empires. Take the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. Over 1,000 rooms, facades stretching hundreds of meters, structural engineering that distributes the weight of multiple stories through precisely calculated load-bearing walls and arches. Interior spaces designed with acoustic properties, with light distribution, with heating systems that work without modern technology. Official history says it was built in the 1750s through 1760s, using the construction methods available at that time. And maybe it was. But stand in front of it, really look at it, and try to imagine the logistics. The number of skilled stonemasons needed. The coordination required to maintain consistent quality across such massive scale. The funding to support that workforce for years. The transportation of materials before railroads existed. It's not impossible, but it's staggering. Move east into Siberia. Cities like Samara, Omsk, Tomsk. According to official histories, these were rough frontier towns in the 1800s, recently established as Russian expansion pushed across the Urals into previously unsettled territories. And yet these towns have government buildings, railway stations, cathedrals that display the same architectural sophistication as anything in Moscow or St. Petersburg. Ornate columns, intricate sculptural details, domed structures requiring complex understanding of how to distribute weight in 3 dimensions, decorative metalwork of extraordinary precision. These aren't simple log cabins or rough frontier structures. These are buildings that look like they belong to long-established civilizations with accumulated architectural knowledge, with pools of skilled craftsmen, with economic surplus to dedicate to beauty and grandeur. The Kazan Cathedral in St. Petersburg provides a specific example worth examining closely. Built officially between 1801 and 1811. 96 columns, each precisely cut from granite, each placed to support the structure while creating visual harmony. Interior acoustics that allow whispers to carry across vast spaces. Structural engineering that has kept the building standing through over 2 centuries of Russian winters, through wars, through environmental stress. Modern engineers who study it express something between admiration and puzzlement. The techniques work, but explaining exactly how they were executed with documented 1800s technology requires assuming levels of skill and coordination that seem almost superhuman. This isn't about the buildings being beautiful, though they are. It's about what their existence implies. Building similar structures today requires cranes, steel reinforcement, computer-aided design, large coordinated workforces with specialized training. We're told these were built with hand tools, manual labor, basic equipment, which is possible. Humans have built remarkable things throughout history with seemingly primitive technology. But the timeline feels compressed. 10 years to build a cathedral of that complexity, a few decades to fill a frontier city with ornate municipal buildings. The logistics feel unclear. Where did the skilled workers come from? How were they trained? How was such construction funded in regions that were supposedly economically underdeveloped? Official histories provide answers. Russian imperial expansion brought wealth from resource extraction. Skilled craftsmen migrated from established cities. Large labor forces, including serfs and prisoners, provided the workforce. European architectural knowledge spread eastward. All of this is documented. All of this happened. But somehow, the answers feel incomplete when you're standing in front of the buildings themselves. When you're looking at the precision, the scale, the consistency across such vast territories. The buildings exist. They're real. But the story of how they came to exist, That story feels like it's missing something. Walk through the old districts of St. Petersburg on a winter evening. The streetlights cast yellow pools on snow-covered sidewalks. The buildings loom on either side, their facades illuminated, their windows glowing. And if you're paying attention, if you're looking at the buildings rather than just walking past them, you might notice something odd. The proportions feel wrong. The buildings seem to sit too low, as if they've settled into the ground more than they should have. Look at the windows at street level. In many buildings, they're small, set low, almost like basement windows. But the decorative work around them suggests otherwise. Elaborate stone framing, ornate metalwork, architectural details that seem too sophisticated for basement spaces. Now look at the windows on what appears to be the second floor. They're large, grand, proportioned like main entrance windows. The doorways tell the same story. Many buildings have entrances that require walking down several steps to reach, or that have been modified with awkward ramps to make them accessible from current street level. The doors themselves often show signs of having been shortened, their tops modified to fit under what's now ground level. This pattern appears not just in St. Petersburg, but across Russia, across Europe, in cities throughout North America. Buildings where the basement windows are too ornate, where the ground floor feels like it was meant to be higher, where you can peer through lower windows and see architectural details that suggest these spaces weren't designed as basements. In some buildings, you can see partial columns, the tops of decorative arches, carved stonework that's now below grade, but was clearly meant to be visible. The conventional explanation for this is well documented and reasonable. Cities throughout history have raised their street levels for practical reasons. Installing underground utilities requires digging up streets, and when you put them back, you sometimes add height. Dealing with recurring flooding often involves literally raising the ground level of entire districts. Improving drainage means raising streets above the water table. Seattle did this famously in the late 1800s after a fire destroyed much of the downtown. Chicago did something similar. There are photographs, city records, engineering documents showing exactly how and why it was done. So buried first floors aren't mysterious in themselves. We know cities do this. What's puzzling is the scale and the consistency. How many cities raised their street levels? When exactly did this happen? Why aren't these major urban transformations better documented in many locations? The Seattle and Chicago examples are well known because they were so dramatic and unusual. But if you accept that similar street raising happened in dozens or hundreds of cities across multiple continents, you're accepting that something fairly unusual happened repeatedly, something that left buildings across the world appearing to sink into the ground. Some people interpret these buried floors differently. They suggest that the ground level changed not through planned civic engineering projects, but through some kind of catastrophic event or series of events. Massive mud flows burying cities, floods depositing layers of sediment, some kind of geological or atmospheric catastrophe that caused rapid accumulation of earth around existing structures. The buildings weren't buried deliberately. In this interpretation, they were buried by disaster, and subsequent generations simply adapted, making the second floors into ground floors, turning former main entrances into basements. The alternative explanation raises more questions than it answers. What kind of event would bury buildings across multiple continents? How would such catastrophes be poorly documented if they occurred in the relatively recent past? Why would people rebuild on top of buried structures rather than excavating them? But the conventional explanation has questions too. Why would so many cities undertake similar street-raising projects? Why would they bury elaborate first floors rather than modifying buildings as they raised streets? Why do many of these buried levels show architectural sophistication that seems wasted on spaces intended as basements? Stand on a street corner in any old city and look down at basement windows showing carved stone friezes, ornate window frames, architectural details clearly designed to be displayed and admired. Then look at the historical records, trying to find documentation of when and why the street was raised, trying to find the civic engineering projects that would explain it. Sometimes you find clear answers. Often you find gaps, assumptions, vague references to improvements and modernization, but little specific detail about major alterations that should have been significant civic undertakings. The buildings sit there, half buried, their lower floors underground, their entrances modified, their proportions suggesting they were designed for a different ground level than the one they now occupy. Something happened. The question is what and when, and whether the conventional explanations account for all of what we can observe. There are buildings scattered across the territories once labelled Tartaria that do things buildings shouldn't be able to do, at least not without technology that officially didn't exist when they were built. Or that's the claim. The reality is more nuanced, more interesting, and harder to dismiss than it might first appear. Start with acoustics. St. Isaac's Cathedral in St. Petersburg. Stand in one corner and whisper. Your voice carries across the entire space, reaches every corner with perfect clarity. No electronic amplification, no modern sound engineering. Just stone and space and angles calculated so precisely that sound waves behave exactly as intended. The Bolshoi Theatre displays similar properties, perfect acoustics in every seat, even the cheapest seats in the highest balconies. Modern acoustic engineers study these spaces, use computer modeling to understand how they work, and what they find is sophisticated understanding of how sound propagates, reflects, interferes, focuses. This isn't accidental, this is engineered. Now, acoustic engineering isn't supernatural. Humans have understood sound reflection and reverberation for centuries. Ancient Greek theatres had remarkable acoustics. Roman amphitheatres could project voices to thousands. So the existence of good acoustics in 1800s buildings doesn't prove anything extraordinary. But it does demonstrate that whoever built these structures possessed sophisticated practical knowledge of physics, geometry, material properties. They knew things that official timelines suggest they shouldn't have known yet, or at least shouldn't have known how to apply so consistently across multiple buildings. The lighting in some of these buildings tells a similar story. Natural light channeled through precisely placed windows, reflected off surfaces positioned at calculated angles, distributed through interior spaces in ways that minimize the need for artificial lighting. Again, not impossible with documented technology, but impressive. Requiring understanding of light behavior, careful planning, executed with precision. Some buildings include what appear to be light wells, internal shafts that carry natural light deep into structures, using reflection and diffusion techniques that wouldn't become standard architectural practice until much later. Then there's the heating mystery. Some buildings in extremely cold climates seem to maintain relatively stable temperatures without obvious heating systems proportional to their size. No massive fireplaces, no evidence of furnaces large enough to heat such volumes. Some researchers point to unusual architectural features, specific types of wall construction, air circulation passages, underground channels that might utilize geothermal principles. Are these evidence of lost heating technology? Or just clever, passive climate control that we no longer fully understand because we rely on mechanical systems? The most controversial observations involve what theorists call free energy systems. Look at the spires and towers on many historical buildings. Tall, elaborate, topped with metalwork that's officially decorative, but that some people interpret as functional. Antenna-like structures, copper or bronze elements positioned as if designed to capture or conduct something from the atmosphere. Theorists suggest these might have been part of wireless energy systems, drawing power from atmospheric electricity or Earth's magnetic field, concepts that Nikola Tesla experimented with, but that mainstream science considers impractical. This is where the investigation splits between observation and speculation. The spires exist. The metalwork is real. You can photograph it, measure it, analyze its composition. What you can't prove is function. Mainstream archaeology views these elements as purely aesthetic or symbolic. Religious symbolism reaching toward heaven. Artistic expression. Status symbols showing wealth and sophistication. That interpretation is reasonable, possibly correct, but some researchers ask, why would purely decorative elements follow such consistent patterns across multiple buildings and cultures? Why would they include features that look functional insulators, conductors, specific geometric arrangements? Ancient and historical cultures often embedded function within form. Roman aqueducts are beautiful and carry water. Gothic flying buttresses are artistic and structural. Is it possible that some architectural elements served purposes beyond what we currently recognize? Not free energy in the sense of perpetual motion or physics-defying impossibility, but perhaps clever exploitation of natural phenomena, techniques for collecting and utilizing atmospheric or geothermal energy in ways we've forgotten because we developed different technological paths. Or perhaps these are just decorative elements, beautiful for beauty's sake, and the search for hidden function is projection, pattern-seeking, the human tendency to find mystery where there's only craftsmanship. Both interpretations remain possible. What's certain is that these buildings demonstrate capabilities: acoustic engineering, light management, climate control, structural sophistication that required significant practical knowledge. Whether that knowledge was developed in the 1800s or inherited from earlier sources, whether it represents the peak of documented technology or something beyond it, remains genuinely unclear. The buildings stand as evidence of something. The question is, evidence of what? There are photographs from the 1800s that show something strange. Not the subjects themselves, which are ordinary enough city streets, construction workers, buildings under renovation. What's strange is what the photographs reveal when you look closely. Workers digging, not digging to build something new, but digging down, excavating, removing earth from around structures that appear to have been buried. Buildings emerging from soil as if they'd been covered and were now being uncovered. Look at photographs of San Francisco from the 1860s and 70s. Multiple images show extensive excavation work throughout the city. Workers with shovels removing dirt from around building foundations. Structures that appear half buried being gradually exposed. Streets being lowered or buildings being raised. It's hard to tell which, but the amount of earth being moved is substantial. The official explanation for these photos is straightforward: urban development, infrastructure improvements, grading streets, installing utilities, all normal activities for a growing city. Similar photographs exist from cities across Eastern Europe, from various Russian cities, from locations throughout the world. Workers digging around old buildings, structures sitting in excavated pits as if they'd been unearthed rather than built. Ground levels that appear unnatural, too high around buildings, requiring excavation to reveal lower floors. Again, conventional explanations exist for all of this. Street level changes, drainage improvements, basement excavations, nothing mysterious necessarily. But taken together, the photographs prompt a question. How much digging happened in the 1800s? How many cities underwent major excavation projects? And why? The mudflood theory emerges from looking at these images and seeing not construction but recovery, not building but uncovering. The theory suggests that sometime in the relatively recent past, 1700s or 1800s, a catastrophic event, or series of events, buried cities under layers of mud, sediment, or debris. What we interpret as construction photographs might actually be excavation photographs. What we think of as building might have been digging out. The geological evidence that theorists point to is scattered but intriguing. Sediment layers in various locations that don't quite match conventional geological timelines. Layers that seem too recent, too rapidly deposited, too inconsistent with gradual accumulation. Marine fossils found in landlocked areas at elevations where they shouldn't be, suggesting either ancient oceans or more recent catastrophic flooding. Buried forests like the one at Nesquin Beach in Oregon, where tree stumps emerge from the sand at low tide. Evidence of a forest that was suddenly buried and preserved. Mainstream geology explains these features through ancient processes. Ice ages that reshaped landscapes millennia ago. Prehistoric floods from glacial melting. Gradual sedimentation over thousands of years. Tectonic shifts that raised ancient seabeds to current elevations. These explanations are supported by extensive geological evidence and accepted scientific consensus. The timelines are ancient, the process is gradual, the catastrophes prehistoric. But mudflood theorists question those timelines. They suggest that some of what we attribute to ancient processes might be more recent. They point to the speed at which certain geological processes can occur under catastrophic conditions. Volcanic eruptions that bury entire regions under ash in hours. Earthquakes that trigger liquefaction, turning solid ground temporarily into liquid that can swallow structures. Massive floods that deposit meters of sediment in days. Atmospheric events, solar storms, cometary impacts, unknown phenomena that could trigger cascading disasters. If such an event occurred in the 1700s or 1800s, the theory goes, it would explain several mysteries simultaneously. It would explain why buildings appear buried. It would explain gaps in historical records as populations struggled to survive and rebuild. It would explain the apparent loss of previous civilizations, including potentially Tartaria, whose cities and infrastructure were buried, and whose survivors were too disrupted to maintain their cultural continuity. It would explain the extensive reconstruction documented in 1800s photography, not building new cities, but excavating and restoring buried ones. The theory requires accepting that a massive catastrophe occurred recently enough to affect standing structures, but long enough ago that explicit memory of it has faded from mainstream historical consciousness. That's a narrow window, roughly 2 to 3 centuries. It requires accepting that such a catastrophe left limited documentation despite occurring in a period when literacy and record-keeping were established. It requires explaining why some regions appear to have been affected while others weren't, or why the effects varied so dramatically across different areas. Mainstream geology doesn't recognize evidence of such recent global catastrophe. The sediment layers date to ancient periods. The buried structures have conventional explanations. The 1800s photographs show normal urban development, but the theory persists because the visual evidence is striking. Those photographs of workers digging around buried buildings, those basement windows too ornate for basements, those ground levels that seem wrong. Something happened to reshape urban landscapes. The question is what and when, and whether conventional explanations account for all the observations. If there was a mud flood, if there was catastrophic burial followed by excavation and recovery, historical records should contain traces. Descriptions of the disaster, accounts of the recovery effort, documentation of the massive undertaking required to dig out buried cities. So what do the records from that period actually say? The 1700s and 1800s weren't quiet centuries. Disasters struck with disturbing regularity, events that killed thousands, destroyed cities, altered climates, and reshaped societies. These aren't theoretical catastrophes. They're documented, studied, acknowledged by mainstream history. The question is whether they were isolated incidents or pieces of something larger. 1755. Lisbon, Portugal. An earthquake estimated at magnitude 8.5 strikes on a religious holiday when churches are full. The ground shakes for minutes. Buildings collapse throughout the city. Then comes the tsunami, waves over 10 meters high that sweep through the harbor and flood the lower city. Then comes the fire, started by overturned candles and cooking fires, spreading through the rubble, burning for days. When it ends, tens of thousands are dead. Much of Lisbon is destroyed. The disaster is so profound, it triggers theological debates across Europe about divine providence and the nature of God. 1815. Mount Tambora in Indonesia erupts with a force that makes it one of the largest volcanic explosions in recorded history. The eruption ejects so much ash and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere that it affects global climate. 1816 becomes known as the year without a summer. Snow falls in July in New England. Crops fail across Europe. Famine spreads. Social upheaval follows as food prices spike and populations starve. The effects persist for years. The atmosphere takes time to clear, and the crisis reshapes societies that experience it. 1859. The Carrington event, named after astronomer Richard Carrington who observed it. A massive solar storm, a coronal mass ejection that hits Earth's magnetic field. Telegraph systems across Europe and North America spark and fail. Operators receive shocks. Telegraph paper catches fire. Auroras appear as far south as the Caribbean, so bright that people wake thinking it's dawn. If similar solar activity occurred today, it would devastate electrical infrastructure, damage satellites, disrupt communications globally. In 1859, the technology was primitive enough that damage was limited, but the event demonstrated that Earth's atmosphere can be dramatically affected by solar phenomena. These disasters are real, documented, studied, but mainstream history treats them as separate events. The Lisbon earthquake was an earthquake. The Tambora eruption was a volcanic event. The Carrington event was a solar storm. Each had its causes, its effects, its place in the timeline. Alternative theorists look at the same events and ask, what if they weren't separate? What if they were symptoms of a larger pattern? Pieces of a systemic disruption that affected Earth more profoundly than individual disaster narratives suggest. The year without a summer particularly intrigues researchers because its effects were global, sustained, and disruptive enough to leave extensive documentation. Diaries from across Europe and America describe the strange weather, the failed crops, the desperate conditions. This wasn't localized. This affected entire hemispheres. And while mainstream science attributes it to volcanic ash, the theory is based on inference and modeling. We know Tambora erupted. We know climate anomalies followed. We assume causal connection. But what if the volcano was responding to something else? What if both the eruption and the climate disruption were effects of a larger cause? Here's the challenge for mudflood theory. If a civilization-ending catastrophe buried cities and destroyed societies in the 17 or 1800s, where are the explicit records? Why don't we have newspapers describing cities being buried? Why don't we have government documents detailing recovery efforts? Why don't survivors' accounts fill libraries with descriptions of the disaster? Theorists offer several explanations. Perhaps records were deliberately destroyed during post-catastrophe power consolidation, as new authorities established control and wrote histories that served their interests. Perhaps populations were so disrupted that systematic record-keeping broke down, and what survived was fragmentary, localized, interpreted differently by later historians. Perhaps the catastrophe was interpreted through religious or cultural frameworks rather than scientific ones, leaving records that sound mythological rather than factual, descriptions of divine judgment or apocalyptic events that modern historians read as allegory rather than literal reporting. Or perhaps we do have records, but we interpret them wrong. Historical writings from various cultures describe floods, darkness, years of famine, social collapse. We read these as localized events or symbolic narratives. What if some were literal descriptions of experienced catastrophe? Medieval chronicles often describe disasters in language that sounds exaggerated to modern ears. Population estimates seem inflated, destruction seems overstated, recovery seems too rapid. We assume exaggeration. What if the descriptions were accurate and our assumptions are wrong? The 1800s had earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, climate disruptions, plague outbreaks, solar storms, massive fires, floods that reshaped coastlines. Documented fact. Were these isolated incidents affecting different regions at different times for different reasons? Or were they connected, representing a period of unusual geological and atmospheric instability whose full scope we've forgotten or never fully recognized? The evidence supports both interpretations. The truth might lie somewhere between complete coincidence and coordinated catastrophe, in the difficult territory where patterns emerge but causation remains uncertain. 1893. Chicago. A city barely recovered from a massive fire 2 decades earlier now hosts the world's Columbian Exposition. More than 200 buildings rise on the fairgrounds. The centerpiece is the White City, a cluster of enormous neoclassical structures surrounding lagoons and fountains. Visitors describe it as the most beautiful thing they've ever seen. Massive domes, elaborate colonnades, sculptural details covering every surface. The buildings glow white because they're covered in a mixture of plaster and fiber called staff, designed to look like marble. At night, thousands of electric lights illuminate the scene, a display of technological modernity that amazes visitors from around the world. Official history says these buildings were constructed specifically for the fair, built in roughly 3 years using temporary materials. Wooden frames covered with decorative plaster, designed to look impressive but not to last. After the fair ended, most were demolished, some burned. A few were preserved but eventually deteriorated. By the early 1900s, almost nothing remained of the White City, except photographs and memories. Look at those photographs. Study the buildings. The scale is enormous. The Palace of Fine Arts alone covered multiple acres. The Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building was, at the time, the largest building in the world, with a footprint of nearly 30 acres and a roof span that required innovative engineering. The architectural detail is extraordinary. Sculptures, friezes, ornamental columns, intricate window designs. The photographs show what appear to be substantial, permanent structures, not temporary facades. The puzzle grows when you consider the timeline. The site was basically empty marshland in 1890. By 1893, this entire complex existed, complete with infrastructure for electricity, water, sewage, transportation. That's 3 years to plan, design, and build what amounts to a temporary city. Not impossible with sufficient resources and labour. Armies of workers did labour on the project, that's documented, but the speed still seems remarkable, especially when you consider that many of the workers were supposedly building with techniques and materials they'd never used before. Similar patterns appear at other world's fairs. The 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition in Street Louis, the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco, massive architectural complexes built quickly, used briefly, demolished thoroughly. The official explanation remains consistent. These were temporary structures, exhibition buildings meant to impress visitors for a season, and then be removed to make way for other development. But alternative researchers see something else. They look at photographs of fair construction and notice that some images seem to show excavation as much as building. Ground being cleared, earth being removed, structures being exposed or renovated rather than built from scratch. They note that the decision to demolish such impressive buildings seems economically strange. Why invest enormous resources in creating beautiful structures only to destroy them immediately? Why not preserve them, convert them to museums or civic buildings, capitalize on the investment? The alternative interpretation proposes that these weren't new buildings at all. They were existing structures, possibly from a previous civilization, possibly Tartarian, that were uncovered, cleaned, repurposed for the fairs, and then demolished to hide their true origin. In this reading, the fairs were elaborate deceptions, ways to explain the existence of advanced architecture without acknowledging that it predated modern construction. The temporary nature was an excuse for demolition that would remove evidence. This theory requires accepting that massive architectural complexes existed, were buried, were rediscovered, and were then intentionally destroyed to hide their discovery. That's a complex conspiracy, requiring coordination across multiple cities and decades. The conventional explanation is simpler. Temporary exposition architecture was an established practice in the 19th century. European expositions had pioneered the technique. Large workforces could indeed build impressive facades relatively quickly, using modular techniques and prefabrication. Demolition made economic sense, because the buildings were designed to be temporary, would require expensive maintenance, and occupied valuable land needed for other purposes. Both explanations have supporting evidence. The conventional version has documentation, photographs of construction processes, accounts of workers and architects, economic records of spending and planning. The alternative version has the strangeness of the photographs, the apparent permanence of the structures, the puzzling decision to destroy such beauty, and the pattern of similar events across multiple fairs. Stand in the digital archive looking at photographs of the White City at night, illuminated by electric lights, reflected in lagoons, impossibly beautiful and impossibly temporary. Whether built in 3 years or inherited from previous centuries, whether temporary facade or permanent structure repurposed, those buildings represented something remarkable. They showed capabilities that seem almost excessive for their stated purpose. And then they were systematically destroyed, leaving only photographs and questions. Who decides what gets built and what gets demolished? Who decides what gets preserved and what gets erased? The world's fairs demonstrated power, not just technological power, but the power to create and destroy architecture on massive scale. And whoever controls that power controls more than buildings. They control the story those buildings tell. The 1800s changed how human societies organized themselves in ways that are hard to fully appreciate from our position in the present. Something fundamental shifted in how power structured itself, how information flowed, how collective memory formed. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't announced. But by the end of the century, the relationship between ordinary people and historical narrative had transformed completely. Before the 1800s, history was local, fragmented, diverse. Villages maintained their own stories through oral tradition. Regional chroniclers recorded events that mattered to their specific communities. Multiple competing narratives coexisted because there was no centralized authority to declare one version official and others incorrect. But the 1800s brought centralization. Nation-states consolidated power that had previously been distributed across feudal lords, local authorities, tribal leaders. Borders became sharper, more enforced. Central governments extended their reach into regions that had operated with substantial autonomy. With political centralization came informational centralization. National education systems emerged. Standardized curricula taught in standardized ways. Children across vast territories learned the same history lessons, heard the same narratives about their nation's past, their empire's glory, their civilization's progress. This wasn't accidental. Creating shared national identity required shared national history, teaching that history became a function of the state. National archives and museums appeared, institutions that determined what would be preserved and what would be discarded. Governments collected documents, artifacts, records, organizing them according to their own priorities and perspectives. What got preserved was what served the state's narrative. What contradicted or complicated that narrative might be stored but rarely displayed, might be catalogued but never studied, might exist in physical form but disappear from public consciousness. Academic disciplines formalized during this period. History became a university subject with professional standards, peer-reviewed journals, credentialing requirements. This professionalization improved rigor, established methodologies, created communities of scholars dedicated to understanding the past. But it also created gatekeeping. What counted as legitimate historical inquiry got defined by institutions, and those institutions reflected the values and assumptions of the societies that created them. None of this was necessarily sinister. Centralization brought efficiency. Standardization made education accessible to more people. Professionalization improved the quality of historical research, but these improvements came with consequences. Alternative narratives got marginalized. Local histories that didn't fit national narratives faded. Indigenous knowledge in colonized regions got dismissed as mythology rather than history, oral tradition rather than valid evidence. Winners write history. That's not conspiracy theory, it's observable pattern. When nations conquer other nations, the conqueror's version of events becomes the official version. The conquered people's perspective, if it survives at all, exists in fragments, in private memories, in sources that official historians consider unreliable or biased. European colonizers portrayed the regions they conquered as primitive, backwards, in need of civilization. This wasn't just propaganda. It became the framework through which historians understood and taught about those regions. Sophisticated African kingdoms became primitive tribes in European textbooks. Advanced pre-Columbian civilizations got reduced to human sacrifice and superstition. Apply this lens to Tartaria. If there was an advanced civilization across Central Asia in the 16 and 1700s, why would its history be minimized or erased in 18 and 1900 historical narratives? Several motivations suggest themselves. Colonial powers Russia expanding east, China expanding west, European nations eyeing the region, had political reasons to portray conquered territories as undeveloped. Justifying empire requires presenting conquest as bringing progress to places that lacked it. Acknowledging sophisticated previous civilizations complicates that narrative. Or perhaps, post-catastrophe recovery required rapid consolidation of authority. If massive disasters did disrupt these regions, whoever gained power during recovery would have interest in establishing their own legitimacy, which might involve obscuring what came before. Or perhaps simpler Western academic tradition focused on European history and classical Mediterranean civilizations. Asian interior regions seemed peripheral, unimportant, not worth detailed study. Not deliberate suppression, just institutional bias directing attention elsewhere. The result is the same, regardless of motivation. A massive gap exists in how modern education teaches recent human history. A civilization that appeared on maps for 2 centuries, that travelers described, that left architectural evidence, became invisible in modern historical consciousness. Not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because the institutions that decide what counts as important history decided this didn't count. Whether that decision was deliberate erasure or unconscious bias matters less than recognizing it happened. History isn't what happened. History is what the people with power to shape narratives decided to remember and teach. Which raises the question, what else did they decide to forget? Watch the maps change across the 17 and 1800s, and you'll see borders moving, names shifting, Tartary shrinking as Russia expands. This isn't mysterious. Russian expansion eastward across Siberia and into Central Asia is well documented, taught in every history class that covers the period. What's interesting isn't whether it happened, but what happened to the narratives, the names, the historical memory of what existed before Russian control. Peter the Great and Catherine the Great explicitly campaigned to modernize and expand the Russian Empire. They weren't subtle about it. Official policy, documented in imperial decrees that still exist in archives. Russian explorers, traders, soldiers pushed east across the Urals into territories that maps labeled as parts of Tartary. They established outposts, claimed land, subjugated local populations, built cities, or expanded existing settlements, imposed Russian administrative systems over diverse peoples who had their own languages, cultures, governance structures. This is what empires do. Military conquest followed by administrative integration, followed by cultural assimilation. The British did it. The Spanish did it. American westward expansion followed the same pattern. Conquer the territory, rename the places, rewrite the history to center the colonizer's narrative, present the process as bringing civilization to wilderness rather than as displacing existing civilizations. The Kazakh Khanate, which controlled substantial territories in Central Asia, got gradually absorbed into Russian control through a combination of military pressure, economic integration, and diplomatic maneuvering. Various other Central Asian societies, different ethnic groups, tribal confederations, settled urban populations experienced similar processes. Some resisted and were suppressed. Some negotiated and were integrated. All lost autonomy. All saw their histories subordinated to Russian historical narrative. Names changed. Russian authorities renamed cities, rivers, regions. Places that had names in Turkic languages or Mongolic languages got Russian names. Sometimes the Russian name was just a translation or transliteration. Often it was completely new, erasing linguistic connection to previous inhabitants. This naming practice wasn't unique to Russia. Colonial powers everywhere renamed conquered territories, but the effect is the same. Linguistic heritage disappears, making it harder for later generations to connect current places with historical accounts that used different names. Documents and records got centralized in Russian-controlled archives. Local record-keeping traditions, diverse systems that different peoples had maintained, got replaced with standardized Russian administrative documentation. Histories written in Persian, Arabic, Turkic, Mongolic languages became less accessible, as Russian became the official language of governance and education. The sophisticated cities and administrative systems that travelers had described didn't disappear, but they got relabeled as Russian achievements, as fruits of Russian expansion and modernization, rather than as existing civilizations that Russia absorbed. Russian imperial archives contain explicit policies about standardizing administration, promoting Russian language, suppressing local languages in official contexts. These policies served practical purposes. Empires need communication, need administrative consistency, but they also served ideological purposes, making conquered territories seem like natural extensions of Russia, as if they'd always been destined to be Russian, required minimizing what existed before. By the early 1900s, Soviet authorities completed this process with even more intensity. Soviet historical narratives served explicit state ideology. History became a tool for legitimizing the current political system. In that context, alternative narratives about previous civilizations, about different forms of social organization, about sophisticated societies that existed before Russian or Soviet control, would be systematically excluded or reinterpreted to fit approved frameworks. So, what specifically was lost about pre-Russian civilizations? Were the cities that travelers described absorbed and credited to Russian builders? Were the administrative systems they described dismissed as primitive compared to Russian governance? Was there deliberate minimization of what came before to make conquest seem like progress? Or was it simply that in the process of administrative integration and cultural assimilation, local historical knowledge naturally faded, replaced by the colonizer's narrative, not through conspiracy, but through the ordinary dynamics of how empires absorb territories? Both probably happened, some deliberate, some structural. The result either way, by the time modern historical narratives were formalized, non-Russian perspectives about what existed in these regions had been marginalized to the point of invisibility. Academic history as a formal discipline emerged primarily in 19th-century European universities. Germany led the way, establishing history departments, developing methodologies for source criticism, creating the model that Britain and America would adopt. This professionalization of history was genuine progress in many ways. It established standards for evidence, created communities of scholars who challenged each other's claims, developed rigorous approaches to understanding the past. But these methodologies came with assumptions baked in. What counted as valid historical evidence got defined by the available sources and the languages scholars could read. Written documents became privileged over oral traditions. Official state records carried more weight than local community memories. Sources in major European languages, Latin, Greek, French, German, English, were accessible to Western scholars. Sources in Persian, Arabic, Turkic, Mongolic languages were not, or at least not to most historians working in Western universities during the crucial period when modern historical narratives were being formalized. This created systematic blind spots. Civilizations whose records were primarily written in languages that Western historians couldn't read would be underrepresented in Western historical scholarship. Societies whose historical transmission involved oral tradition, material culture, non-written forms of knowledge preservation would be dismissed or minimized because they didn't fit the documentary model of evidence that academic history required. African and Pacific cultures with sophisticated oral historical traditions got their histories dismissed as mythology by European academics, who insisted real history required written documents. Chinese historical sources existed, but were largely ignored by Western historians until relatively recently because few Western scholars could read classical Chinese. Islamic historical sources similarly remained untranslated and unstudied by mainstream Western academic history for decades. Apply this to Tartaria. If Tartarian civilization's records were primarily in languages that early Western historians couldn't access, Turkic languages, Mongolic languages, Persian, Arabic, their history would naturally be absent from Western textbooks, even without deliberate suppression. If their historical transmission involved forms of knowledge preservation that didn't match academic history's documentary requirements, their sophisticated urban development and administrative systems would seem invisible to historians looking only for specific types of written evidence. Historical focus reflected contemporary political interests. European and American historians in the 1800s and 1900s were most interested in European history, in classical Mediterranean civilizations that they saw as their cultural ancestors, and in the histories of regions their nations were actively colonizing. The interior of Asia, already controlled by Russia and China, held less interest for Western academics. It wasn't their empire, wasn't their cultural heritage, wasn't currently being absorbed into their spheres of influence. This created circular blindness. Western historians didn't study the region in depth because it seemed peripheral and unimportant. It seemed peripheral and unimportant because Western historians hadn't studied it in depth and therefore hadn't discovered reasons to consider it significant. The lack of knowledge justified continued lack of attention, which perpetuated the lack of knowledge. Historical periodization itself reflected European experience. The division into ancient, medieval, modern makes sense for European history, marks meaningful transitions in European societies. Applied globally, it distorts. Civilizations that didn't follow European developmental patterns, that organized time and social change differently, that peaked when Europe was struggling through its own transitions, got forced into frameworks that didn't fit their actual historical trajectories. Modern historians increasingly recognize these blind spots. Post-colonial scholarship, world history approaches, efforts to translate and study non-Western sources are correcting some of the imbalances. But for Tartaria specifically, the damage was done. If institutional biases caused its history to be overlooked during the 1800s and 1900s, when modern historical narratives were being formalized and taught, that gap became foundational. What gets taught as basic historical knowledge in one generation becomes difficult to challenge in the next. Absence becomes normalized. Questions that might have been asked don't get asked because the gaps aren't recognized as gaps, but as simply how history is. This is where the conversation about Tartaria takes its most controversial turn, where observations about architecture meet speculation about lost technology, where what we can see meets what we imagine might have been possible. It's worth approaching this carefully, acknowledging up front that what follows diverges sharply from mainstream science, while still being grounded in things that actually exist and can be examined. Look at the skylines of old cities. The spires rising from cathedrals, government buildings, railway stations. Tall, elaborate, topped with metalwork that's officially decorative, but that some observers see differently. These aren't simple religious symbols pointing skyward. They're complex structures with specific geometric patterns, with copper or bronze elements, with designs that repeat across buildings separated by thousands of miles. Street. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow, with its elaborate onion domes topped with crosses and metalwork. Grand Central Station in New York, with its sculptural peak featuring Mercury, surrounded by geometric forms. Buildings across Europe and Asia and America, all featuring similar vertical elements, similar patterns, similar materials. Why? If these are purely decorative, why the consistency? Why do structures built by different cultures in different eras choose similar solutions? Orthodox churches and civic buildings and train stations all reaching upward with metal-topped spires that follow patterns that start looking less like independent artistic choices and more like standardized design language. Enter Nikola Tesla. Not a fringe figure, but a documented genius whose experiments with electricity changed how humans harness and use power. Tesla's later work focused on wireless power transmission. He proposed that electrical energy could be transmitted through the atmosphere without wires, that properly designed towers could capture and broadcast power, making it freely available. His Wardenclyffe Tower project attempted to demonstrate this. Tesla claimed the technology was feasible, that the physics supported it, that given funding and freedom to develop it, he could make it work. The project was abandoned. Funding dried up. Tesla's later years were marked by increasingly marginalized work, brilliant ideas that never received the support needed for development. The standard explanation focuses on practical challenges and economic realities. Wireless power transmission faces significant technical obstacles. And even if achievable, how would you monetize it? How would energy companies profit from freely available atmospheric power? The emerging petroleum-based energy industries had business models that required controlling supply and charging for consumption. Free energy threatened that model. Alternative researchers look at Tesla's work and ask, what if he wasn't inventing something new but rediscovering something old? What if the spires and towers on historical buildings weren't decorative at all, but functional components of wireless energy systems? What if Tartarian civilization, or whatever advanced society preceded modern industrial civilization, had already solved the problem of atmospheric energy capture? The theory proposes that ornate spires served as receivers, capturing atmospheric electricity or drawing energy from Earth's magnetic field. The metalwork wasn't decoration, but circuitry, conducting captured energy down into buildings where it powered lighting, heating, various functions we now handle with wired electricity. The elaborate brass fixtures and geometric patterns in building interiors, the crystalline chandeliers that appear in many historical structures, might have functioned as parts of energy distribution networks, rather than as pure ornamentation. Mainstream science finds this implausible. No physical evidence of such systems exists. No engineering plans, no written descriptions of how it worked, no artifacts that clearly demonstrate electrical function. The physics of atmospheric energy harvesting presents challenges that even modern technology struggles with. And yet, Tesla claimed it was possible. Ancient structures like the pyramids do align with Earth's magnetic fields, in ways that some researchers interpret as potentially functional, rather than purely astronomical or religious. The rapid shift to petroleum-based energy in the late 1800s did coincide with demolition of many ornate historic buildings and replacement of elaborate older architecture with plainer industrial designs. Could the decorative elements on historical buildings have served purposes we no longer recognize? Not free energy in the sense of perpetual motion or physics-defying magic, but clever exploitation of natural atmospheric and magnetic phenomena using materials and geometries that modern electrical theory doesn't fully account for because we develop different technological paths. Or are these just beautiful buildings with decorative elements that served symbolic and aesthetic purposes, and the search for hidden technology is projection, pattern-seeking in ornate designs that were never meant to do anything beyond look impressive? Both interpretations remain on the table. What's certain? These architectural elements exist, they follow patterns, they appear across cultures and continents. Whether they represent lost functional technology or lost aesthetic tradition, something about how we built and designed structures has been forgotten or abandoned. The question is, what exactly was lost, and whether it was only beauty or also capability? Stand close to an old building, not looking at it from across the street, admiring the overall form, but right up against the stone, examining how the blocks fit together. Run your hand along the joints between granite blocks in a building supposedly constructed in the early 1800s. The gaps are minimal. In some places, you can't slide a piece of paper between stones. The surfaces are smooth, the angles precise, the alignment perfect across dozens or hundreds of blocks, each weighing tons. Modern stonemasons who work with granite and marble know what it takes to achieve this kind of precision. You need diamond-tipped saw blades because granite is too hard for steel to cut cleanly. You need precise measurement tools to ensure blocks mate perfectly. You need lifting equipment to position multi-ton blocks with millimeter accuracy. You need time, lots of time, because rushing stonework leads to mistakes that can't be easily corrected. Cut a block wrong, and you've wasted days or weeks of labor, plus expensive material. The 1800s did have stone-cutting technology. Steam-powered saws existed. Skilled stonemasons trained through apprenticeship systems passed down techniques across generations. Large labor forces, including prison labor and waves of immigrant workers, provided the manpower. Given sufficient time, skill, and resources, precise stonework was achievable. Modern stonemasons don't claim these buildings are impossible. They claim they're impressive, that they represent enormous investments of effort and expertise. But the timelines raise questions. St. Isaac's Cathedral in St. Petersburg, 48 columns, each a single piece of granite weighing 114 tons, each precisely cut and carved with decorative details, each installed in specific positions, requiring extraordinary precision. Official construction timeline: 40 years, from 1818 to 1858. Is that plausible? Engineers calculate how long cutting and positioning one such column would take, multiply by 48, factor in all the other stonework required for the rest of the structure, and arrive at numbers that technically work, but require assuming nearly constant production, with minimal errors across 4 decades. The Kazan Cathedral, 10 years of construction, 1801 to 1811, resulting in a structure with 96 precisely cut and positioned columns, plus all the other ornate stonework. 10 years. Calculate the workforce size required, the coordination needed, the production rate of precisely cut stone, and the numbers work only if you assume remarkably efficient organization and execution, with very little going wrong. These calculations aren't proof of impossibility. Human history contains many examples of remarkable construction achievements using seemingly inadequate technology. What puzzles engineers isn't that it happened, but that it happened so consistently, so repeatedly, across so many projects in relatively short time frames. It suggests either that stone-cutting techniques were more advanced than typically acknowledged, or that the construction timelines aren't complete. Alternative interpretation: these buildings weren't built from scratch in the dates claimed. They're older structures, built by earlier civilizations, with stone-cutting technology we don't fully understand, that were inherited, renovated, adapted by 1800s Russian authorities, who then claimed them as their own construction achievements. This would explain the precision without requiring superhuman efficiency. It would explain why some buildings show evidence of different construction phases, with rougher repair work sitting atop more sophisticated original construction. It would explain stonework that appears weathered beyond what the official age would suggest. Some researchers point to inconsistencies within individual buildings. Sections of pristine, perfectly cut stone adjacent to sections of rougher work. Foundation stones that look ancient, supporting upper stories that look newer, as if the building had multiple construction phases with different capabilities, or as if original, sophisticated work was later modified or repaired by builders who couldn't match the original quality. The mainstream response: construction projects did occur in phases. Skilled workers weren't always available. Budgets fluctuated. Techniques evolved over a building's construction timeline. All of this explains variations in quality without requiring theories about inherited structures. The weathering argument gets countered by noting that pollution, climate, and specific environmental conditions affect how quickly stone appears aged. So we're left with buildings that demonstrate remarkable precision, that required enormous skill and effort, whose construction timelines seem compressed, but not technically impossible. Modern engineers who study them express something between admiration and puzzlement. The work is extraordinary. Whether it represents the peak of documented 1800s capability, or something inherited from earlier, more advanced builders remains genuinely unclear. What's certain? Whoever shaped those stones possessed knowledge of materials and techniques that required extensive accumulated experience. Whether that experience was developed over the decades of official construction dates or inherited from previous centuries, the buildings themselves don't definitively tell us. They just sit there, precisely cut, perfectly fitted, silently challenging us to explain them. Some buildings do things that seem almost impossible without modern technology. Not magic, not supernatural, but sophisticated enough that modern engineers study them, trying to understand how they work. Street, Isaac's Cathedral in Street, Petersburg provides a specific example. Stand in one corner of that enormous space and whisper. Your voice carries to the opposite corner with perfect clarity. Not amplified, not distorted, just transmitted through stone and air with remarkable efficiency. Modern acoustic engineers bring measurement equipment into spaces like this, map how sound behaves, create computer models attempting to replicate the acoustic properties, and what they discover is sophisticated intentional design. The angles of walls and ceilings direct sound waves predictably. Surfaces reflect or absorb specific frequencies. The volume and shape of spaces create resonances that enhance rather than muddle sound. This isn't accidental. This is engineered with deep, practical understanding of how sound propagates, reflects, interferes, focuses. Ancient Greek theatres demonstrate similar principles. Roman amphitheatres project voices to thousands. So, acoustic sophistication in historical buildings isn't unprecedented. But it does indicate that builders possessed knowledge that official timelines suggest they shouldn't have formalized yet. The Bolshoi Theatre, various opera houses across Europe, concert halls built in the 1800s, all demonstrate acoustic properties that modern venues struggle to match, despite computer modeling and advanced materials. Architects studying these spaces acknowledge that historical builders understood something about acoustics that we're still working to fully recover. Whether they developed that understanding through trial and error, experimentation, or inherited it from earlier architectural traditions remains unclear. Then there's climate control. The Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg maintains remarkably stable temperatures despite housing massive collections in a building constructed before modern HVAC systems. It's not magic. It's thermal mass thick stone walls that absorb and release heat slowly, moderating temperature swings. It's air circulation design passages and vents that use convection to move air without mechanical fans. It's strategic window placement that maximizes winter sun penetration while minimizing summer heat gain. Modern building science recognizes all these techniques. We call them passive climate control. But we also recognize that achieving them requires sophisticated understanding of thermodynamics, local climate patterns, building orientation, material properties. How did 1800s builders achieve this? The conventional answer: accumulated knowledge, experimentation, mathematical understanding, applied practically even without modern scientific language. Builders worked empirically, testing designs, learning from failures, refining techniques across generations. This explanation is reasonable, possibly correct. It requires no theories about lost civilizations or inherited technology. But alternative researchers ask, if this knowledge existed in the 1800s, why does so much modern architecture ignore it, relying instead on mechanical systems that consume energy? If passive climate control and superior acoustics can be achieved through design alone, why did we stop building that way? Perhaps because passive systems require more sophisticated initial design, more careful construction, more expensive materials, and craftsmanship. Mechanical systems are simpler, more forgiving, easier to retrofit when building design is inadequate. Or perhaps, theorists suggest, the knowledge wasn't fully understood by 1800s builders because they were working with inherited structures or copying designs whose principles they didn't completely grasp. Perhaps Tartarian or pre-Tartarian builders had developed these techniques, and 1800s architects were adapting rather than inventing. maintaining rather than creating. This would explain why the best examples of acoustic and climate design appear in buildings from that specific period, with later architecture gradually losing those capabilities as the inherited knowledge faded and was replaced by mechanical alternatives. Speculation aside, what's verifiable? Historical buildings demonstrate functional sophistication in acoustics, lighting, ventilation, and thermal control that required genuine expertise to achieve. Whether that expertise was developed in the 1800s or inherited from earlier sources, whether these buildings represent human ingenuity, working within documented technological constraints, or something beyond those constraints, the capabilities exist. The buildings function, they work in ways that modern engineering respects and sometimes struggles to replicate. That's not conspiracy, not alternative science, not fringe theory. That's observable, measurable reality. The question isn't whether these systems exist, but how they came to exist, and why we've lost the consistent ability to create them. Before asking whether Tartaria's knowledge was deliberately hidden, it's worth understanding something simpler. How civilizations lose knowledge even without conspiracy, even without anyone trying to hide anything. Because knowledge disappears. It happens regularly. It's happened throughout human history, to civilizations we absolutely know existed, whose achievements are documented, whose ruins we can visit. If we've forgotten how to do things that people definitely knew how to do, forgetting something larger becomes not just possible but almost expected. Roman concrete. The Pantheon in Rome has stood for nearly 2,000 years, with a dome that remains the world's largest unreinforced concrete dome. Modern engineers examine it with sophisticated instruments, analyze its composition, marvel at its durability. For centuries, we couldn't figure out how Romans made concrete that lasted millennia, while modern concrete crumbles after decades. The formula was lost. Only recently have scientists begun reverse engineering it, discovering that Romans used specific volcanic ash that creates chemical reactions modern concrete lacks. We forgot, not because someone hid the knowledge, but because when the Roman Empire collapsed, the infrastructure for maintaining specialized building knowledge collapsed with it. Damascus steel. Blades from medieval Syria had properties that modern metallurgists struggle to replicate. They were harder, held edges better, showed distinctive wavy patterns. The technique for creating Damascus steel disappeared sometime around the 1700s. We have the swords. We can analyze their molecular structure, but we can't fully reproduce the manufacturing process. Why? Probably because it involves specific ores from particular mines, specific techniques passed through master-apprentice relationships, specific knowledge that wasn't written down comprehensively enough to survive when the tradition died. Greek fire. The Byzantine Empire's secret weapon, a substance that burned on water, that terrorized enemy fleets, that helped defend Constantinople for centuries. We have historical descriptions of its effects. We know it existed, but we don't know what it was made of. The formula was deliberately kept secret, known only to a few, and when those keepers died without passing it on, the knowledge vanished irretrievably. These aren't fringe examples. These are acknowledged historical facts. Civilizations we know existed, technologies we know worked, knowledge that demonstrably disappeared. And if this can happen to Roman engineering, to Damascus steelmaking, to Byzantine military technology, all from civilizations with written records and continuous historical narratives, imagine what could disappear from a civilization that experienced conquest, catastrophe, and systematic marginalization of its history. Knowledge disappears for predictable reasons. When it's passed through apprenticeship rather than writing, it's vulnerable to disruption. One generation fails to train the next, and centuries of accumulated expertise vanishes. When it's deliberately kept secret, trade secrets, guild mysteries, religious knowledge restricted to initiates, it's vulnerable to losing those secret keepers. When civilizations collapse through war or disease or disaster, the social infrastructure that supports specialized knowledge collapses too. Master craftspeople die, libraries burn. The economic surplus that allowed people to dedicate themselves to preserving knowledge disappears as everyone focuses on survival. Conquest accelerates knowledge loss. Victors suppress defeated people's traditions, destroy their records, dismiss their expertise as primitive or heretical. Religious transitions erase previous knowledge systems. Christianity replacing European paganism, Islam spreading across Central Asia, Both involve destroying texts and practices deemed incompatible with new beliefs. Technological change makes old knowledge seem irrelevant. Why preserve complex traditional techniques when modern methods are easier, cheaper, faster? The fact that traditional methods might have certain advantages becomes invisible when economic and practical pressures favor the new. Look at what happened to indigenous knowledge in colonized regions. Native American architectural traditions that created structures perfectly suited to local climates were lost as populations were displaced and forced to adopt European building styles. African agricultural and medicinal knowledge adapted to local conditions was dismissed by colonizers who imposed their own systems, leading to loss of expertise that had been refined over generations. These losses weren't conspiracies. They were the ordinary, tragic result of conquest and cultural disruption. Apply this framework to Tartaria. If there was an advanced civilization whose knowledge transmission relied on apprenticeship, whose records were in languages later populations couldn't read, whose expertise was deliberately suppressed by conquerors, whose traditions were disrupted by catastrophe, then losing that knowledge isn't mysterious. It's what we'd expect. The buildings remain because stone doesn't forget, but the knowledge of how to build them, why they were designed that way, what purposes they served, that knowledge could easily vanish, leaving us with impressive ruins and no instruction manual. Natural forgetting explains much. But history also contains deliberate destruction, systematic erasure of knowledge by authorities who had specific reasons for wanting certain information to disappear. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented historical practice, repeated across cultures and centuries, performed openly by powers that saw controlling information as essential to controlling populations. The Library of Alexandria. The details are debated when exactly it burned, whether it was one catastrophic fire or gradual destruction across multiple incidents, who was responsible. But the general fact isn't disputed. One of the ancient world's greatest repositories of knowledge was destroyed. Scrolls and texts from across the Mediterranean and beyond, accumulated over centuries, gone. What was lost? We don't know. That's the nature of destroyed knowledge. We have references to texts that no longer exist, hints of what the library contained, but the actual information vanished with the burning. China, 213 BCE. The Qin dynasty's burning of books and burying of scholars. The emperor ordered destruction of historical records that contradicted his regime's legitimacy. Books burned. Scholars who resisted were executed or buried alive. This wasn't accidental. This was deliberate policy to control the past, to erase competing narratives, to make the emperor's version of history the only version that could be taught. Spanish conquest of the Americas. Conquistadors and missionaries systematically destroyed Maya and Aztec codices, the painted books that recorded these civilizations' history, astronomy, religious practices, administrative records. Only a handful survived, hidden or overlooked. Bishop Diego de Landa, who personally supervised the burning of Maya texts, later wrote that he regretted the loss of knowledge, but believed it necessary to eliminate pagan beliefs. The destruction was intentional, motivated by religious conviction that indigenous knowledge was spiritually dangerous. These patterns repeat throughout history. Conquerors destroy conquered people's records because erasing their history makes resistance harder, makes the conquered forget they were ever independent or powerful. New regimes destroy previous regimes' archives to delegitimize them, to prevent their return to power, to establish narrative control. Religious authorities destroy heretical texts to maintain doctrinal purity. Authoritarian governments destroy information that threatens official narratives. Now apply this to Tartaria. If there was a civilization across Central Asia with libraries, archives, administrative records, what happened to them during Russian and Chinese expansion? The Russian Empire's campaigns involved military conquest. Armies don't just take territory. They capture cities, occupy administrative centers, seize or destroy local institutions. Soviet consolidation in the early 1900s involved centralizing all archives under state control. Documents that contradicted Soviet ideology or that gave too much credit to pre-Soviet civilizations were systematically destroyed or hidden. The Cultural Revolution in China similarly purged historical records deemed problematic. Historians who study Central Asian archives acknowledge that massive amounts of material were lost, damaged, or removed during various conquests, and political transitions. Libraries disappeared. Texts were taken to Moscow or Beijing and never seen again in their home regions. Local administrative records that might have documented sophisticated pre-Russian or pre-Chinese governance were destroyed or relabeled as primitive systems that needed Russian or Chinese modernization. If Tartarian civilization had cities with libraries and archives, those institutions would have been precisely in the regions that experienced these disruptions. Would conquering armies have preserved those records carefully? Would Soviet archivists have maintained documents suggesting that sophisticated non-Russian civilizations existed in territories Russia claimed to have civilized? Would Chinese authorities have promoted historical narratives about advanced independent societies in regions China was absorbing? This doesn't prove Tartaria existed, but it does explain why evidence might be sparse even if it did exist. Deliberate destruction of conquered people's records is historically normal. It's what conquerors do. The evidentiary gap we observe maps showing Tartaria, but few detailed records of what it actually was, fits perfectly with the pattern of conquest followed by archival destruction. If Tartaria's books burned, if its libraries were scattered, if its administrative records were destroyed, or relabeled, or locked away in archives that researchers don't access because they don't know to look for them, then what we'd observe is exactly what we do observe. Physical structures remaining, travelers' accounts persisting, but comprehensive documentation absent. The absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence when we know that evidence gets deliberately destroyed. It's evidence that whoever won the conflicts in Central Asia controlled what stories survived and what stories disappeared. There's a third possibility between natural forgetting and total destruction: secret preservation. The idea that knowledge didn't disappear but went underground, maintained by groups who recognized its value and protected it from those who wanted it erased. This is where Tartaria theories venture into their most speculative territory, but it's worth examining because secret preservation of knowledge isn't entirely fantastical. It has historical precedent, though perhaps not quite the way theorists imagine. Freemasonry provides the most commonly cited example. Masonic orders do preserve certain knowledge through their traditions, specifically architectural and geometric knowledge that they claim traces back to medieval stonemason guilds. Those guilds were genuine historical institutions that guarded trade secrets, techniques for cutting stone, and designing structures that they passed only to initiated members. Knowledge was power. Maintaining secrets meant maintaining professional advantage. Modern Freemasonry claims continuity with those older traditions. Whether that claim is historically accurate is debated, but what's certain is that Masonic symbolism involves extensive building and construction imagery, that Masonic rituals include geometric and architectural elements, and that many prominent architects and builders in the 1700s and 1800s were Masons. The symbolism appears in buildings from that period. Masonic organizations were involved in designing cities, planning civic structures, overseeing major construction projects. Tartaria theorists look at this and ask, what if Masonic orders preserved not just medieval European architectural knowledge, but older, more extensive technical information from Tartarian or pre-Tartarian civilizations? What if the geometric patterns and building imagery in Masonic symbolism aren't just metaphorical but encode actual construction techniques? What if the secrecy isn't about ethics and brotherhood, but about technical knowledge that someone wanted suppressed? There's no hard evidence for this. Most Masonic scholars say the organization's knowledge is philosophical and ethical, that the building symbolism is allegorical, that they're not hiding advanced lost technology. But secret societies by definition don't advertise what they actually know. The whole point of secrecy is that outsiders can't verify what's being kept secret. Absence of public evidence doesn't disprove the theory, because the theory predicts absence of public evidence. Other groups get mentioned in these theories: Rosicrucians, various esoteric orders, networks of scholars who might have recognized value in older techniques and preserved them through informal channels. Throughout history, knowledge has survived outside official institutions. Monastic orders preserved texts through Europe's medieval period, when secular libraries disappeared. Certain craft traditions maintained techniques through family networks when guilds collapsed. Oral traditions carried information across generations when written records were destroyed. So the broader point isn't entirely implausible. Knowledge can survive through non-official channels. If Tartarian architectural techniques were valuable, if craftspeople recognized that they produced superior results, they might have preserved them through practical application, even without documenting them in ways historians would recognize. Master builders might have taught apprentices techniques whose origins they didn't fully understand, maintaining practices because they worked, not because they knew where they came from. This creates an interesting possibility. Maybe sophisticated architectural features in 1800s buildings weren't newly invented or inherited from intact structures, but preserved through builder communities who maintained techniques across generations. Maybe the knowledge wasn't completely lost, but transformed, simplified, partially understood, applied without full comprehension of principles. Maybe Masonic and similar organizations served as carriers for practical architectural knowledge that had deeper roots than their official histories acknowledge. Or maybe the secret society angle is projection, people seeing mystery where there's just fraternal organization, interpreting symbolism as code when it's actually just symbolism. Maybe Freemasons know exactly what they claim to know, ethical principles and fraternal bonds, and the architectural imagery is purely metaphorical. Maybe knowledge was simply lost, either naturally or deliberately, and isn't hiding in secret vaults waiting to be rediscovered. Both remain possible. What's certain is that knowledge can survive through unofficial channels, that craft traditions can maintain practices whose theoretical foundations are forgotten, that practical expertise sometimes persists even when written records disappear. Whether this specifically happened with Tartarian knowledge through Masonic or similar networks is unprovable with current evidence. But it's not conceptually impossible. Knowledge has hidden before. Whether it's hiding now is a different question, one that might be answered not by speculation, but by actually examining what these organizations preserve and comparing it carefully to what the buildings themselves demonstrate. We've spent considerable time examining observations that support Tartaria theories, looking at maps and buildings and gaps in historical narratives. But intellectual honesty requires examining the other side with equal attention. What do mainstream historians and archaeologists actually say about all this? Not dismissive ridicule, but substantive explanation. Because the conventional academic response to Tartaria theories isn't just, "That's ridiculous." It's more comprehensive, more grounded in evidence than skeptics of mainstream history often acknowledge. The fundamental mainstream position is straightforward. Tartary was never a unified empire or advanced civilization. It was a European geographical designation, a catch-all term for the vast interior of Asia that Europeans didn't understand in detail. Professional historians explain that European cartographers used Tartary the same way they used terms like the Indies or Africa as vague regional labels for places they knew existed but couldn't describe precisely. These weren't political designations. They were admissions of ignorance, ways of labeling blank spaces on maps that needed labeling. The maps showing Tartary, subdivided into Russian Tartary, Chinese Tartary, independent Tartary, weren't depicting one empire fragmenting. They were depicting European cartographers gradually learning that what they'd been calling one thing was actually multiple different regions controlled by different peoples and powers. As geographical knowledge improved, the vague term got replaced by more accurate specific names. That's not erasure. That's the natural progression of how human understanding develops from general to specific. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Extensive work in Central Asia, Siberia, and Mongolia has documented what actually existed in these regions during the period in question. Mongol successor states, various khanates like the Kazakh Khanate and Siberian Khanate, nomadic federations and tribal confederations, trading cities along the Silk Road. These civilizations left evidence that archaeologists have been studying for decades. Burial sites, pottery, tools, coins, written documents in Turkic and Mongolic languages, architectural remains that show clear cultural continuity with known historical peoples. What archaeology doesn't find is evidence of a single, unified, technologically advanced Tartarian empire. It finds exactly what historical records describe. Diverse cultures at various development levels, some nomadic, some settled, some sophisticated in certain ways, all operating within the technological parameters expected for their time periods. Not primitive, not backwards, but also not harboring lost super technology or constituting one vast advanced civilization. Regarding the architectural puzzles, mainstream historians provide detailed explanations. Yes, the buildings are impressive. Yes, they required enormous skill and resources. But the Russian Empire in the 1800s did possess such resources. Wealth from resource extraction, taxation of vast territories, control of trade routes. Skilled craftspeople were available through multiple channels. European architects and engineers hired to work on imperial projects, apprenticeship systems that trained Russian craftspeople, immigrant labor from various regions, and unfortunately forced labor, including serfs and prisoners, whose suffering made grand construction possible. The construction timelines that seem impossibly compressed become more plausible when you account for the actual workforce sizes involved and the brutal labor conditions. Yes, building a cathedral in 10 years seems fast. It's less implausible when you consider crews working year-round, multiple shifts, laborers pushed to exhaustion, projects prioritized with imperial resources behind them. Not admirable working conditions by modern standards, but capable of producing impressive results. Buried first floors have straightforward explanations in most cases. Urban infrastructure improvements are thoroughly documented. Cities did raise street levels to improve drainage, install underground utilities, deal with flooding. Chicago and Seattle provide unambiguous examples, where the process is photographed, documented in city records, explained in contemporary engineering reports. Similar processes occurred elsewhere, sometimes less dramatically, but following the same basic pattern of urban improvement, raising ground levels around existing buildings. The mainstream argument concludes with Occam's razor, the principle that simpler explanations are generally more likely than complex ones. Tartaria theories require assuming massive coordinated conspiracy involving multiple governments, academic institutions, and professional organizations, all agreeing to hide a lost civilization. The conventional explanation requires accepting that European geographical terminology was imprecise, that impressive architecture was built through documented means, that urban infrastructure changed in documented ways, and that our knowledge of certain historical periods and regions is incomplete but not deliberately suppressed. Which is simpler? Which requires fewer unsupported assumptions? Mainstream scholars argue their explanation fits available evidence without requiring conspiracy, cover-up, or extraordinary claims about lost technology. It's not necessarily the correct explanation in every detail, but it's parsimonious, grounded in verifiable evidence, and doesn't demand accepting extraordinary premises. That's the skeptical case, presented fairly. It deserves consideration alongside the mysteries and anomalies we've been exploring. The mainstream explanation is comprehensive, logical, supported by substantial evidence. But does it address every observation? Are there puzzles that remain even after accepting conventional historical frameworks? Because intellectual honesty cuts both ways. If alternative theorists should acknowledge the strength of mainstream arguments, mainstream scholars should acknowledge where their explanations feel incomplete or where genuine mysteries persist. Modern engineers studying historical stonework do express puzzlement sometimes, not claiming impossibility, but acknowledging that achieving certain levels of precision with documented period technology required either extraordinary skill or techniques we don't fully understand. The response isn't that ancient or historical peoples couldn't have done it, but rather an admission that we're still learning how they did. Mainstream archaeology actively researches these questions, trying to understand ancient construction methods, precisely because modern engineers find them impressively difficult to replicate. Historical records do have gaps. Central Asian history, particularly, has documented lacunae. Archives lost to fires, to wars, to simple neglect. Documents written in languages that remain poorly studied. Texts that survived physically, but haven't been translated or widely analyzed. Mainstream historians acknowledge these gaps. They work to fill them through archaeology, through studying surviving sources more carefully, through translations and interdisciplinary collaboration. But acknowledging gaps means acknowledging that our understanding remains incomplete. Some architectural timelines do feel compressed, even accounting for large workforces and intensive labor. Not impossible, not requiring alternative explanations, but sitting at the edge of plausibility in ways that prompt questions. How much coordination was really achievable? How did quality control work across such massive projects? How were skilled craftspeople trained quickly enough to meet these timelines? Mainstream historians have answers, But sometimes the answers themselves raise further questions. The disappearance of Tartary from maps and common usage is acknowledged by geographers as relatively thorough. Geographical terminology does change, place names do evolve, but usually you find transitional periods, continued usage in certain contexts, or residual traces in place names and regional designations. Tartary's erasure was unusually complete, not suspicious necessarily, not proof of deliberate suppression, but noteworthy. Mainstream scholars don't dispute this observation. They just interpret it as natural linguistic evolution, rather than evidence of hidden history. Science progresses by investigating anomalies. Things that don't quite fit prompt deeper investigation. Sometimes, investigation confirms the anomaly was misunderstood, and existing explanations were correct all along. Sometimes, investigation reveals gaps in understanding and leads to revised theories. The Tartaria phenomenon, regardless of whether its central claims are valid, serves a useful function. It draws attention to aspects of 17 and 1800s history that deserve more investigation. The sophistication of Central Asian civilizations before Russian and Chinese absorption. The mechanics of large-scale construction projects in that era. The processes by which geographical knowledge and terminology evolved. These are legitimate historical questions worth studying more carefully. Perhaps the truth sits between the poles. Not mainstream dismissal that treats every question as settled and every alternative theory as worthless, but also not full acceptance of Tartaria theories in their most ambitious forms. Perhaps Central Asian civilizations were more substantial and organized than Western textbooks typically acknowledge, without being a unified, advanced empire. Perhaps 1800s architectural achievements do incorporate some inherited knowledge or recovered techniques, without requiring lost super technology. Perhaps historical narratives have biases and gaps that merit examination, without everything being deliberate conspiracy. The mysteries persist. Some observations remain genuinely puzzling, even after considering mainstream explanations. That doesn't validate any particular alternative theory, but it does suggest that confident certainty, whether from alternative theorists or mainstream scholars, might be premature. History is complex. Our understanding is incomplete. Acknowledging that isn't weakness. It's the foundation for honest inquiry. Step back from maps and buildings and competing theories. Ask a different question. Why does this resonate? Why do Tartaria theories attract such passionate interest? Why do communities form around investigating them? Why does this particular mystery capture imaginations in ways that more conventional historical questions don't? Because the answer to that question matters regardless of whether Tartaria itself was real. These theories represent something larger than historical curiosity. They embody a fundamental skepticism about institutional authority, about official narratives, about who gets to decide what counts as truth. That skepticism isn't irrational. History demonstrates repeatedly that institutions do hide information, do construct narratives serving their interests, do marginalize perspectives challenging dominant stories. Governments classify documents. Corporations suppress unfavorable research. Academic gatekeeping excludes certain questions from serious investigation. These aren't conspiracy theories. These are documented realities of how power operates. Tartaria theories, even if factually incorrect about their specific claims, channel legitimate concerns about transparency and honesty. They ask, who benefits from the stories we're told? What might be hidden? Can we trust authorities who have demonstrable track records of concealing information when it suits their purposes? These questions deserve asking, even if the answers aren't what alternative theorists believe. There's also a profound sense of loss animating these theories, a feeling that humanity has forgotten something important, that we're not as advanced as we imagine, that past civilizations possessed knowledge or wisdom we lack. This resonates because it contains truth. We have lost knowledge, Damascus steel, Roman concrete, countless craft traditions and technical capabilities that our ancestors possessed and we can't fully replicate. Ancient peoples were more sophisticated than 19th and 20th century historians credited. Modern civilization does have blind spots, does prioritize certain types of knowledge while neglecting others, does assume linear progress when historical reality is more complex. Tartaria becomes symbolic of all lost knowledge, all forgotten wisdom, all the ways that human development doesn't follow the neat upward trajectory that progress narratives suggest. The theories propose cyclical history. Civilizations rise, achieve heights, fall, and the cycle repeats. This cyclical view challenges modern assumptions about inevitable progress, about humans always building on previous achievements, about knowledge only accumulating, never disappearing. The challenge itself has value, even if the specific Tartarian narrative isn't accurate. These theories also create community. Online spaces where people investigate together, share observations, build collaborative understanding. In an atomized society where many feel alienated from mainstream institutions, these communities provide belonging, shared purpose, intellectual engagement. People dismissed as gullible or irrational by critics are actually demonstrating valuable qualities: curiosity, independence of thought, willingness to question, collaborative knowledge building. The conclusions might be wrong, but the impulses driving the inquiry aren't. Rather than dismissing alternative theorists, mainstream institutions might ask, why do so many people distrust us? What have we done to create such widespread skepticism? How have academic gatekeeping, media consolidation, government secrecy, and institutional arrogance contributed to people seeking truth outside official channels? These are uncomfortable questions that establishment figures prefer avoiding, but they're important regardless of Tartaria's reality. Whether Tartaria existed or not, investigating the question teaches valuable skills. Looking at built environments more critically, questioning timelines and explanations, rather than accepting them passively, researching primary sources, thinking carefully about how we know what we claim to know, about the difference between evidence and interpretation, about the role of power in shaping collective understanding. These capabilities matter for navigating all information, not just historical questions. Maybe Tartaria wasn't real, but the hunger for hidden truth that drives people to investigate it, the distrust of official narratives that makes them receptive to alternatives, the community that forms around shared inquiry, these are very real and worth understanding whether you believe in lost civilizations or not. After examining maps, buildings, historical records, mainstream arguments, and alternative theories, what can we actually conclude about Tartaria? The honest answer is that the question doesn't have a simple yes or no resolution. Truth doesn't exist at the poles, but somewhere along a spectrum of possibilities, each with different degrees of plausibility, each supported by different types and amounts of evidence. At one end sits complete mainstream acceptance. In this view, Tartary was purely a geographical designation, a vague European term for regions they didn't understand in detail. No unified civilization existed behind the name. All the impressive buildings were built exactly when and how official records state, using documented 1800s technology and labor. The apparent anomalies that alternative theorists point to result from misunderstanding evidence, from not appreciating what skilled craftspeople could achieve with period tools, from pattern seeking in ambiguous data. This position is held by most professional historians and archaeologists. It requires no conspiracy theories, no lost technology, no hidden history. It's parsimonious, straightforward, supported by conventional academic methodology. Move slightly along the spectrum to a position that accepts the mainstream framework while acknowledging gaps and biases. Here, the basic historical narrative is correct, but Western academic tradition has underestimated the sophistication of Central Asian civilizations. The regions Europeans labeled Tartary did contain more organized, advanced societies than textbooks typically acknowledge. Some architectural knowledge in the 1800s may have been inherited or recovered from earlier cultures rather than invented from scratch. But there's still no evidence of a unified Tartarian empire or genuinely advanced lost technology. This is where many moderate skeptics sit, accepting conventional history while recognizing its limitations. Further along the spectrum sits the position that a substantial civilization did exist across Central Asia in the 16 through 1800s, more unified and sophisticated than mainstream histories acknowledge. Russian and Chinese expansion absorbed this civilization, deliberately minimizing its history to justify conquest. Much of the architecture attributed to 1800s Russian construction was inherited from this earlier society. But claims about free energy and impossible technology remain unsupported. The civilization was advanced within normal historical parameters, not possessing capabilities beyond documented technology of the era. This moderate alternative position questions official narratives while avoiding the most speculative claims. Continuing toward the alternative end, we reach the position that a genuinely advanced Tartarian civilization existed, with technology exceeding what mainstream history attributes to the period. Some capabilities were deliberately suppressed by emerging power structures. Much knowledge was lost through catastrophe and conquest. Physical evidence remains in the form of architecture, but understanding of how it functioned has vanished. This position requires accepting that historical narratives are more flawed than mainstream scholars acknowledge, that technological suppression occurred, that significant knowledge has been lost or hidden. At the far end sits complete alternative acceptance. An extraordinarily advanced global civilization existed until recently, possessing free energy, construction technology beyond current capabilities, sophisticated knowledge deliberately hidden by power structures who orchestrated its erasure. Major catastrophe destroyed this civilization in the 17 or 1800s. Modern historical narratives are largely fabricated to hide this past. Current institutions descend from those who engineered the cover-up. This position requires accepting extraordinary claims about conspiracy, suppression, and coordinated historical falsification on massive scale. Each position has evidence supporting it and challenges confronting it. The mainstream view has the weight of academic consensus and conventional evidence, but struggles to explain certain architectural anomalies and the completeness of Tartary's disappearance. The moderate positions balance mainstream and alternative observations, but satisfy neither camp fully. The strong alternative positions explain anomalies that mainstream views struggle with, but require accepting premises that lack definitive proof. Most people investigating Tartaria probably fall somewhere in the middle positions, questioning official narratives without embracing the most radical alternative claims. The value isn't in declaring one position definitively correct, but in recognizing that complex questions rarely have simple binary answers. History is interpretation of fragmentary evidence. Different observers examining the same evidence can reach different conclusions, not because one is honest and another dishonest, but because evidence underdetermines theory. Multiple interpretations can be logically constructed from available data. Certainty eludes us here. We're dealing with gaps in the historical record, with observations that support multiple interpretations, with questions where definitive answers require evidence we don't currently possess. Perhaps Tartaria will remain permanently in this ambiguous space, never fully proven, never fully disproven, occupying the uncomfortable territory where evidence meets interpretation and clarity fades into possibility. Or perhaps future discoveries will shift the balance decisively toward one position. For now, the spectrum itself is the most honest representation of where we stand. Whatever position you take on the spectrum, whatever theories you entertain about Tartaria's reality or fiction, certain facts remain undisputed. The buildings exist. They're not theoretical constructs or disputed claims. They're physical structures you can visit, touch, measure, photograph. So setting aside the contested interpretations, what do the buildings themselves actually tell us? They tell us that whoever built them had sophisticated mathematical knowledge. The symmetry isn't approximate, the proportions aren't accidental. The geometric relationships embedded in these structures demonstrate understanding that requires either advanced mathematical training or accumulated practical knowledge refined over generations. You don't achieve this level of precision by accident or through trial and error alone. They tell us that organized, well-resourced societies existed capable of coordinating large-scale projects. Scattered nomadic tribes don't build cathedrals and government palaces. These structures required planning that stretched across years or decades. They required coordinating hundreds or thousands of workers. They required securing funding, materials, expertise. They required social organization complex enough to conceive, plan, and execute massive architectural undertakings. They tell us that accumulated technical knowledge existed regarding materials, structural engineering, construction techniques. The builders understood how different stones behave under stress. They knew which materials worked for which purposes. They grasped principles of load distribution, of how to span distances without collapse, of how to create stable structures that would endure for centuries. This kind of knowledge doesn't appear suddenly. It develops through experience, through learning from failures, through incremental improvement across generations. They tell us that beauty mattered. These buildings aren't purely functional. The decorative elements serve no structural purpose. The carved details, the ornate metalwork, the carefully planned aesthetic harmony all demonstrate that whoever built them valued beauty, craftsmanship, permanence. They were creating something meant to impress, to inspire, to last beyond their own lifetimes. What the buildings don't definitively tell us: exactly when each was built. Architectural analysis can suggest approximate dates based on style and technique, but style can be copied, techniques can be preserved or recovered. They don't definitively tell us who built them, in the sense of which specific civilization or culture. Russian imperial records claim credit, but claiming credit and originating are different things. They don't tell us what specific construction methods were used, whether the capabilities they demonstrate were developed in the 1800s or inherited from earlier periods, whether they represent continuous advancement or recovered knowledge. These buildings deserve more investigation than they typically receive. Whether they're 1800s Russian achievements representing that empire's wealth and sophistication, or inherited structures from earlier Tartarian civilization, or something in between those poles, they're remarkable accomplishments worthy of study, preservation, careful analysis. The Tartaria phenomenon has created renewed interest in them. More people visit them now, photograph them, ask questions about them, examine details that might otherwise go unnoticed. That attention has value, regardless of which theories prove correct. Stand before one of these buildings, not looking at photographs on a screen, but actually standing in front of stone and metal and glass. Feel the scale, the precision, the presence. These structures connect us to humans who lived generations ago, who solved problems we're still puzzling over, who created beauty that endures. Whether those humans lived in the 1800s or earlier, whether they were inventing techniques or applying inherited knowledge, they were real people with real skills, creating real, lasting works. Perhaps the most important thing the buildings tell us is that history exists in physical form, not just in documents. We can learn by looking, by measuring, by analyzing material culture. Archaeological and architectural evidence complements written records, sometimes confirms them, sometimes contradicts them, always adds dimensions that texts alone can't provide. The buildings invite us to be active investigators rather than passive receivers of whatever story we're told. They stand there silently asking, "Figure us out. Understand how we came to be. We're not going anywhere. We'll wait while you work out the answers." The investigation doesn't end with uncertainty. Saying, "We don't know for sure," isn't defeat. It's the starting point for better inquiry. So what would constitute progress in understanding these mysteries? What paths forward might actually advance knowledge, rather than just perpetuating arguments between entrenched positions? More rigorous study of the buildings themselves, using modern analytical techniques, materials analysis that can establish more precise dates, construction sequence analysis that can reveal whether buildings were erected all at once or in phases, engineering studies that can determine what techniques were actually required versus what's claimed in historical records. Some of this work is already happening. Engineers and architects are examining historical structures with renewed interest, sometimes confirming conventional timelines, sometimes raising new questions that deserve investigation. Better access to historical sources in multiple languages. Relevant information exists in Russian archives, Chinese records, Persian and Arabic historical texts, documents in Turkic and Mongolic languages. Much of this material remains untranslated, inaccessible to Western researchers, unstudied by scholars who lack language skills or access to where the documents are held. Making these sources available, translating them, analyzing them alongside Western sources would significantly improve understanding of what existed in Central Asia during the periods in question. Interdisciplinary collaboration, bringing together historians, archaeologists, engineers, materials scientists, linguists, all examining these questions from their different perspectives. History is too complex for single disciplines to capture fully. The divide between mainstream and alternative researchers is counterproductive. Both groups share interest in understanding the past. Both make observations worth considering. Better discourse requires both improving. Alternative researchers embracing rigorous methodology. Mainstream scholars taking public questions seriously rather than dismissively. Specific research questions that could advance understanding. What construction techniques were actually used in particular buildings? Can dating be established more precisely through scientific analysis? What do Central Asian historical sources say about regional civilizations before Russian and Chinese absorption? How do architectural styles show continuity or change over time? What archaeological evidence exists for settlement patterns and urban development? These are concrete questions amenable to investigation using established scholarly methods. Good investigation doesn't require accepting any particular theory beforehand. It requires open-minded analysis, willingness to let evidence lead conclusions, rather than forcing evidence to fit predetermined narratives, acknowledging when data is ambiguous, rather than claiming certainty where none exists. Some Tartaria enthusiasts engage in poor methodology, cherry-picking evidence, ignoring context, making unsupported leaps. Some mainstream scholars engage in knee-jerk dismissal without serious examination. Both approaches impede understanding. You don't have to be a professional researcher to participate in this investigation. Visit historical buildings in your area. Look at them carefully. Ask questions. Research local history and architecture. Examine primary sources where you can access them. Think critically about information from all sources, mainstream and alternative. The Tartaria phenomenon demonstrates that historical investigation isn't exclusively for academics. Anyone with curiosity and critical thinking can contribute to collective understanding. History belongs to all of us, not just to institutions and experts, but to everyone interested in understanding where we came from and how we got here. Your questions matter. Your observations matter. Your curiosity has value. The investigation continues not in universities and archives alone, but in the minds of everyone who looks at an old building and asks how it came to be. Everyone who examines a historical map and wonders why the names changed. Everyone who maintains healthy skepticism about official narratives, while also maintaining healthy skepticism about alternative claims. That's not passive consumption of answers. That's active participation in humanity's ongoing effort to understand itself. We've traveled through thousands of words examining maps that show empires that aren't in textbooks, buildings that seem to defy their official construction dates, historical records that contradict each other, mainstream explanations and alternative theories. And after all that examination, after looking at evidence from every angle we can manage, the honest answer to what was Tartaria remains stubbornly elusive. We still don't know for certain, and that's okay. Sometimes the most intellectually honest answer is simply, I don't know. In an age of confident claims and absolute positions, admitting uncertainty feels almost radical. We're surrounded by voices declaring certainty about everything. Political commentators who never doubt. Social media posts that present opinion as fact. Even academic authorities who sometimes overstate how much we actually know. Certainty feels secure. Uncertainty feels threatening, like standing on unstable ground. But what if uncertainty isn't weakness? What if it's actually the most accurate reflection of reality for complex questions, where evidence is fragmentary and interpretations compete? The Tartaria question isn't unique in this regard. History contains countless mysteries where definitive answers elude us. We don't know exactly how Stonehenge was built, which specific techniques moved those massive stones into position. We don't know who Homer actually was, whether one person or multiple poets working across generations. We don't fully understand the Bronze Age collapse, why sophisticated civilizations across the Mediterranean suddenly failed around 1200 BCE. These aren't fringe mysteries. These are acknowledged gaps in mainstream historical understanding. And we live with them. We have theories, some more plausible than others, but not certainty. History is interpretation of incomplete evidence, always provisional, always subject to revision when new evidence emerges or new analytical frameworks develop. That's not a bug in historical knowledge. That's how historical knowledge works. Certainty closes inquiry. Uncertainty keeps it open. If we declare definitive answers, either Tartaria definitely existed as an advanced empire, or Tartaria definitely never existed as anything significant, we stop looking, stop questioning, stop remaining open to evidence that might complicate our conclusions. Living with uncertainty about Tartaria specifically offers several benefits. It models critical thinking, demonstrating that even after thorough investigation, sometimes we arrive at maybe rather than definitely. It creates space for new evidence and new perspectives. If we're certain we already know, we won't notice information that contradicts our certainty. It's intellectually honest, and that honesty builds trust more effectively than false confidence. People recognize when they're being told something with more certainty than the evidence actually supports. But uncertainty doesn't mean relativism, doesn't mean all interpretations are equally valid. We can hold uncertainty about specific questions, while still recognizing that some claims have better evidence than others, that methodology matters, that standards of evaluation exist. Saying, "I'm not certain what Tartaria was," doesn't require accepting every theory as equally likely. It means recognizing that current evidence supports multiple interpretations, that we lack the definitive proof needed to declare one absolutely correct and all others absolutely wrong. The world is complicated, history is messy, evidence is fragmentary. Simple, certain answers often mislead, obscuring complexity in favor of neat narratives that feel satisfying but aren't actually true. Thoughtful uncertainty reflects genuine understanding of that complexity. It's the position of intellectual humility, of recognizing what we know and what we don't, of being honest about the limits of current knowledge, rather than pretending those limits don't exist. We don't know everything about Tartaria. We do know something. We know questions remain unanswered. We know the investigation continues. That's an honest place to stand, a foundation for continued searching rather than an endpoint. Uncertainty isn't defeat. It's acknowledgement that reality doesn't always provide the clear answers we'd prefer, and that sometimes living with ambiguity is more honest than forcing premature conclusions. Uncertainty about Tartaria's specific reality doesn't mean this investigation was pointless. We've learned things along the way that matter regardless of whether any particular theory proves correct. These lessons extend beyond the question of one lost civilization to how we understand history, evidence, and truth itself. We've learned that historical narratives are constructed, not discovered intact. History doesn't just exist waiting to be found. It's actively created by people choosing what to emphasize, what to minimize, which sources to trust, which framework to use for interpretation. This doesn't mean history is fiction, or that all narratives are equally arbitrary. It means recognizing that human perspectives, biases, institutional priorities all shape how the past gets understood and taught. Understanding this makes us more critical consumers of historical information from any source, mainstream or alternative. We've learned to pay attention to physical evidence, to material culture that exists independent of written narratives. Buildings, artifacts, landscapes tell stories that sometimes confirm and sometimes contradict documentary sources. Walking up to an old building and actually looking at how the stones fit together, noticing details about construction and proportion, asking how this was actually made. These observational skills apply beyond Tartaria to engaging with the built environment generally. Material evidence speaks, if we learn to listen. We've learned that absence of evidence is complex, can result from many causes. Just because something isn't in textbooks doesn't automatically mean it didn't happen. Just because something appears in alternative theories doesn't automatically mean it did happen. Evidence can be absent because it never existed, or because it was lost naturally, or because it was destroyed deliberately, or because institutional biases directed attention elsewhere. Critical thinking requires considering why evidence might be absent before jumping to conclusions about what that absence means. We've learned that past peoples were more sophisticated than simplified narratives suggest. Whether Tartaria specifically represents lost advanced civilization or not, investigating the question highlights how capable, knowledgeable, and clever humans have always been. Ancient and historical peoples solved complex problems, created lasting beauty, achieved remarkable things, often with less technological support than we have. Respecting that sophistication, avoiding condescension about the past, recognizing human ingenuity across all periods, these attitudes serve us well beyond any single historical question. We've learned that asking questions has value, even without reaching definitive answers. The Tartaria investigation has created renewed attention to historical buildings, prompted deeper examination of Central Asian histories, fostered communities of people engaged in shared inquiry. These outcomes matter regardless of which theory proves correct. The journey of investigation creates value independent of the destination of certain knowledge. We've learned that complex phenomena resist simple single explanations, that reality is usually messier than neat narratives suggest. Some buildings might represent 1800s construction, others might incorporate earlier structures, some might reflect inherited knowledge, others might be built entirely from scratch. Multiple factors probably contributed. Multiple explanations might simultaneously hold pieces of truth. Comfort with complexity, with multifaceted answers, serves us better than insisting on one simple explanation for everything. We've learned to apply skepticism even-handedly, to question mainstream narratives with the same rigor we apply to alternative theories. Good critical thinking doesn't mean rejecting institutional knowledge automatically, but it also doesn't mean accepting it uncritically. Asking, "How do you know?" to everyone, including authorities and experts, cultivates independent thought while still respecting genuine expertise. We've learned that humans need mystery, wonder, shared inquiry, communities of curiosity. The social and psychological functions served by Tartaria investigation matter. People coming together to explore questions, to share observations, to think collectively about big mysteries. This represents something valuable about human nature, our need for wonder and for collaborative meaning-making. These lessons apply far beyond Tartaria. They're tools for engaging with any complex question where evidence is incomplete and interpretations compete. They're frameworks for navigating information environments where multiple voices claim truth, and we must evaluate carefully. The investigation has been worthwhile, not because it solved a mystery definitively, but because it equipped us with better approaches to thinking about mysteries in general. That's real value, regardless of whether Tartaria existed. In the end, Tartaria isn't really about maps and buildings and buried cities. It's about bigger questions, questions that transcend any single historical mystery, questions every generation asks and every individual must grapple with. Who decides what's true? What have we forgotten? How do we preserve what matters? Why do mysteries attract us? What does it mean to really know something? The Tartaria phenomenon highlights fundamental tensions between institutional authority and individual inquiry. Who gets to determine historical truth? Academic experts with credentials and methodologies? Governmental institutions with resources and archives? Or anyone willing to examine evidence and think critically? The healthiest answer probably involves both, respecting genuine expertise while maintaining independent critical thinking, trusting specialists while remembering that specialists have blind spots and biases, accepting that knowledge is distributed across institutions and individuals and emerges through dialogue between them. Tartaria theories tap into deep intuition that humanity has lost important things, forgotten capabilities, and wisdom we once possessed. This intuition is valid whether Tartaria specifically existed or not. We have lost knowledge, Roman concrete, Damascus steel, countless craft traditions and techniques. Civilizational memory is fragile. What we don't actively preserve, we lose. What we don't value, we allow to disappear. The Tartaria question asks, what else have we forgotten? What else are we forgetting right now, in this moment, through inattention or through active suppression? These questions about the past are also questions about our present and our responsibility to the future. Mysteries attract us for reasons deeper than idle curiosity. In an age where everything seems explained, mapped, catalogued, reduced to data and algorithms, unexplained mysteries offer something precious: space for wonder, room for imagination, permission to believe that reality might be more complex and strange and wonderful than official narratives suggest. This attraction isn't irrational. It's deeply human, reflecting our need for enchantment, our resistance to reductionist certainty that drains magic from existence. The Tartaria investigation forces epistemological questions. How do we know what we claim to know? What standards of evidence are appropriate? When should we accept expert consensus? When should we question it? How do we distinguish legitimate skepticism from conspiracy thinking untethered from reality? These aren't easy questions with formulaic answers. They require nuanced thinking, case-by-case judgment, willingness to hold competing considerations in balance. Imagine standing before one of these buildings late at night. The street is quiet. The structure rises above you, illuminated against darkness, stone and metal and glass assembled with precision and purpose. People built this. Real humans with real hands solved real problems to create what you're looking at. They're gone now, whoever they were, whenever they lived. But their work remains, and you're standing there asking questions about how it came to be, who created it, what it means. That continuity across time matters more than any specific answer about Tartaria's reality. That connection between past and present, between the builders who created and the observers who wonder, between the evidence that remains and the questions that persist. History isn't just facts about dead people. It's living relationship between past and present, between what came before and what we make of it now, between the physical traces that endure and the meanings we construct from them. So go look at old buildings. Ask questions. Think critically. Remain curious. Challenge official narratives, but also challenge alternative ones. Seek truth, while accepting that truth is sometimes partial, fragmentary, uncertain. Build communities around shared inquiry. Preserve wonder while practicing skepticism. Remember that the greatest mysteries aren't always the ones we solve, but sometimes the ones that keep us searching, wondering, paying closer attention to the world around us. The investigation continues. Your investigation continues. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with impossible buildings and forgotten cities and questions without easy answers, because those are the questions that make us most fully human.